Chapter 190. Therefore, all of the officials in the capital had to act with their tails between their legs. However, with so many officials, even if they could endure it for a while, they couldn't endure it for a lifetime. They had to make arrangements for their daily expenses. Just based on their position, how could it be enough? Therefore, even though there was a strict crackdown now, there were still people who fell into Gong Dai's hands one after another. Therefore, Gong Dai's existence was a thorn in everyone's heart, a blade above their head. However, he was deeply favored and had the imperial army in his hands. In the entire capital, no one had more military power than him. It could be imagined that he was an existence that made people both hate and fear him. Now, Gong Dai still wanted to climb up. Therefore, he could only abolish the disciplinary department set up by the founding emperor of the dynasty and expand the functions of Zhao Prison. He would swallow up the disciplinary department and become a new judicial organization. However, this Zhao Prison was different from the disciplinary department's 3 departments. He would make Zhao Prison only listen to the emperor and only listen to him. As for the 4th prince, not only did he have the duty of investigating, 2 of the 3 departments were his people. Naturally, he became the next target that Gong Dai wanted to deal with. Unfortunately, last time, the 2 wrongful cases came out at the same time and left the disciplinary department in a terrible fix. After the emperor heard about it, he became furious and almost punished them. Coincidentally, at this time, Gui Fei Long suddenly revealed that she was pregnant. The emperor was overjoyed and suppressed this matter. What a pity, he almost succeeded. Gong Dai looked at the person in front of him, the right chief imperial censor, Zhu Buping. A dark light flashed through his eyes. This person was very capable, especially when his life was threatened. He was actually able to dig up 2 wrongful cases from over a decade ago. He was a talent. Although the emperor had lightly let go of the last matter, there must have been a seed of dissatisfaction and suspicion left in his heart. Once again, he had to hit the nail on the head. Therefore, he decided to give Zhu Buping another chance. Gong Dai thought as he got off the bed and walked in front of Zhu Buping. His approach made Zhu Buping's crouched body uneasy and shrink back. He was truly afraid of this youth, Gong Dai. He was like a ghost, always giving you a fatal blow when you least expected it. However, he was high up and didn't care about the life and death of others. Zhu Buping had seen the scene of Gong Dai supervising the execution with his own eyes. There were so many people. A total of 300 to 400 people. He did not even blink as he watched the executioner's knife fall. Many commoners screamed and didn't dare to look anymore. The accompanying officials were pale. Only he had a smile on his face. He seemed to be very happy. At that time, he understood that he could not afford to offend this young man. However, as luck would have it, Gong Dai still managed to trace it back to him. Back then, in order to get promoted and earn more money, he had embezzled a large sum of money. That money was meant for disaster relief, but in the end, all the rice sent to the disaster area was rotten rice. Many of them could not be eaten anymore, and many people starved to death. He thought that all these years had passed, but he did not expect that he would still be found out and fall into the hands of Gong Dai. Thinking of this, he buried his head even lower, his heart pounding against the ground. The closer Gong Dai got, the faster it jumped. He could clearly feel that the lives of those involved in the case were now firmly in Gong Dai's hands. Life and death in a single thought. Every second was torture. You want me to give you another chance? He did not refer to himself as a prince or this king, but used the word I lightly. However, this did not make them feel close to the young man. Instead, they felt that he was even more unfathomable. The young man's toes were less than an inch away from his forehead. Zhu Buping did not dare to raise his head and used an extremely cautious and careful tone to plead. We beg your highness to be magnanimous and give us another chance. As soon as he finished speaking, the people kneeling behind him cried out in unison. We beg your highness to be magnanimous. Gong Dai smiled faintly. Since that is the case, I can give you another chance. When he said this, Zhu Buping could not hide his excitement. He hurriedly raised his head. When he raised his head, he met the other party's condescending gaze. Those eyes were faint and carried a trace of danger. Only, I have one more thing that I want you to do. Ju Buping's heart trembled. He bowed again and said, "Your Highness, please instruct us. We will do anything." Gong Dai smiled faintly. His slender figure slowly walked back to the bed and sat back down. Isn't Imperial concubine long pregnant with a dragon descendant? But at this juncture, isn't it too much of a coincidence? He saw that Ju Buping's body had suddenly tensed up, and he smiled somewhat strangely. Almost all of your families have daughters in the palace, and you also have spies in the palace. I hope that you can check the authenticity of this. This won't be difficult, right? Thinking of Imperial concubine Long's iron bucket defense, Ju Buping wiped the cold sweat on his forehead and said, "It's not difficult, it's not difficult." Gong Dai nodded in satisfaction. "If that's the case, you may leave." When they heard this, they felt as if they had been pardoned. But when they thought of the new task, they felt a little heavy. But on one side was their lives, and on the other side was an adventure. Their lives were more important. Moreover, Gong Dai never mistreated those who worked for him. This was one of the comforts. After everyone left, Gong Dai rubbed the space between his eyebrows and felt a little impatient. At this moment, Lo Chi walked in quietly and brought a piece of news. "Your Highness, according to the spy's report, the tributaries you mentioned are almost at the border with Yuheng." Gong Dai's black eyes lit up, and his spirit was lifted. Back then, in order to persuade him to help build the canal after he returned from the West Continent, Gong Yimo had told him her plan. Therefore, even though Gong Yimo's whereabouts were unknown, he could still wait for her at the place where she would appear. There was news that Yuheng was also building the canal, and it was in the direction of Daiyu State. Then, in the territory of Daiyu State, she would definitely not let go of the tributaries that were built according to the blueprint she had left behind. Therefore, it didn't matter where she was in Yuheng, or whether she was working for the second prince of Yuheng. As long as she hadn't given up on her plan to smuggle herself into Yuheng, he would have a chance to meet her. Thinking of this, he quickly got up and prepared to leave the residence. Lo Chi asked, "Your Highness, what are you going to do?" "Enter the palace." "But you just asked for leave from His Majesty yesterday, saying that you were ill and needed rest. What reason do you want to use this time?" Gong Dai was obviously in a very good mood, and he actually started to explain. "The capital is becoming more and more clean under Imperial Father's rule. Then, I'll go out and see if there are any parasites that have not been removed." Speaking of this, his eyes were smiling, as if he was just a youth who was about to go out and have fun. His eyes were full of longing. He was not worried that this suggestion would be rejected. The people of the capital were eager for him to leave, so they would try their best to facilitate this so that he could leave quickly. Unfortunately, if they thought that they could sit back and relax after he left the capital, they were too naive. Chapter 191. At the same time, Gong Che received the news as well. In fact, when he received Kim Yoon's letter, he was already tempted. Mo Er's blueprint had been designed in such a way so that she could connect with Yuheng. Firstly, it was for smuggling purposes. Secondly, it was also for her wish to establish trade between the four countries in the future. Furthermore, Kim Yoon had been following the original plan to repair it. Who knew if Mo Er was in Yuheng? Because he was afraid of scaring her away, Gong Che purposely said that he couldn't leave, but he would send someone to contact Kim Yoon's people. If Mo Er was really involved in this matter and had been in Yuheng for more than a year, then she would definitely be one of the people he would meet this time. Therefore, Gong Yimo didn't expect that her trip, which she thought was safe, would have two people eyeing her covetously. It wasn't that she didn't think of this, but she didn't expect that someone would be so attentive and try their best to capture her every move. Therefore, she let down her guard. She was prepared to cross the mountains to bypass the checkpoint, but she inadvertently found something interesting. As she thought about it, she opened her palm. There were two grey stones with black clay on them. Limestone. If it weren't for the fact that she didn't have the energy to improve the furnace and didn't have any ores to calcine the fire bricks. Otherwise, she could have made cement to pave roads. It seemed that when she had time, she would have to go mining. Some rare metals were very helpful for forging, such as the furnace. Once refractory materials were added, the furnace's temperature would be greatly increased. It was a great help for smelting. However, These were all too far away. She wrapped the stones in a handkerchief and kept them in her arms as she continued walking. At this speed, she would probably reach Dai Yu State in 2 days. Just like that, she carried a strange feeling of anticipation as she reached Dai Yu State. Dai Yu State and Yuheng shared many borders, and the place she was at belonged to Xian before she transmigrated. The local food was very special, and it whetted her appetite. "Come, sir, your noodles." The waiter left after putting down a bowl of noodles. The thick noodles were enough to whet anyone's appetite. Gong Yimo ate in big mouthfuls, playing the role of a man to perfection. "Have you heard? Zhong Yuany's strange illness has been cured." Another voice quickly asked, "Who is it? He actually has such great ability." "I'm not sure. I heard that he's a young man who looks like a celestial being. He saved someone with just a pill. I heard that he looks like he's out of this world." Gong Yimo did not listen carefully. The world was so big, and it was normal for there to be a few outstanding people. It was not surprising. After eating the noodles, she was ready to continue her journey. However, she was a greedy person. Before she left, she cleaned up the place. At this time, she was glad that she had the space. The summer leaves were green like hair oil, but it was still very comfortable to walk in the forest. At this time, she was riding a horse, swaying leisurely. She was holding a piece of sugar-coated rice cake in her hands as she ate. The horse beneath her also lowered its head to graze from time to time. However, after walking for a while, she was blocked by someone. It was a young man in white, wearing an exaggerated mask that only children would like. It was incompatible with his clothes and temperament. Gong Yimo felt that he looked familiar. She even forgot to continue eating the rice cake in her hands. The other party's eyes were fixed on her, or rather, on the sugar cake in her hands. She swallowed her saliva. "Miss, can I use these to exchange for the biscuits in your hands?" As he spoke, he took out some bottles. Just the bottles themselves were worth a lot. Although he was wearing a mask, his eyes were purer than the snow on Mount Yunding. However, when he spoke, Gong Yimo could not help but cry. "Master," this was her master's voice. She had always been thinking about him, but did not have the courage to see him. Now, he appeared in front of Gong Yimo, as pure and clean as when they first met. Seeing Gong Yimo cry, Qiu Xingfeng was so scared that he did not know what to do. He did not understand why the girl would cry just because he wanted to exchange food with her. The things in his hands were said to be very valuable by his disciples, and he did not touch anything. Could it be that his mask was too scary? He had no choice. When he was in the city, everyone was staring at him, which made him very uncomfortable. That was why he chose such an ugly mask. It must have scared her. As he thought, he reached out and took off his mask. At that moment, it was as if the sun had shone through the cracks and lit up this space. Heaven and earth were overshadowed. His face was extremely beautiful, and what was more rare was that he retained the original purity of the world. That pair of limpid eyes blinked, revealing a clean smile. "Miss, I am not a bad person." As a result, Gong Yimo cried even louder. Yes, this otherworldly person in front of her looked like a teenager, but he was actually 27 years old. However, his mind was forever stuck at 10 years old, that age when he was smart, cunning, and pure and kind. Gong Yimo cried as she jumped off the horse's back. She followed his words and took out all the food in her space, letting him choose what to eat. Seeing Gong Yimo take out the food empty-handed, Qiu Xingfeng was not afraid, but rather excited. "Miss, why do you have so much food? Can I exchange with you?" Gong Yimo wiped her tears, and said in a choked voice, "You can, take whatever you want. I'll fill you up." Qiu Xingfeng was very satisfied. Gong Yimo took out vegetarian food, but he only ate vegetarian food. He estimated that he still had 3 bottles of elixirs, so he could exchange for 3 types of food with this girl. Moreover, he cleverly chose the bigger food, thinking that he had taken advantage of her. Little did he know that elixirs on Mount Yunding were hard to come by. He was too well protected by his grandmaster. His 10-year-old mind did not know the price. Gong Yimo watched in a daze as he only took 3 and put them in the small bag he carried with him. Then, he put the elixirs in her hand, bowed, and left obediently. Wait. Gong Yimo seemed to wake up from a dream, and called out to him. Is there anything else? Qiu Xingfeng was in a difficult position as he grabbed his bag. Was this lady going back on her words? But what could he do? He was a vegetarian and didn't know what wild vegetables and fruits he could eat. He had been hungry for an entire day as he hurried through the mountains. Gong Yimo only needed to look at him to know what he was thinking. His actions, coupled with his clean eyes, were too easy to guess. Gong Yimo could not help but relax her tone. She asked softly, "Do you have a disciple?" When she asked this, she was very nervous. Her whole heart was nervous, but she did not know what answer she wanted to hear. Chapter 192. In her previous life, her master had brought her master to visit Dai Yu State. She had wanted to sneak away but was discovered by the palace servants. In a moment of desperation, she bumped into him and was saved by him. At that time, Qiu Xingfeng, who was only 11 or 12 years old, was very interested in the 3-year-old child. Coincidentally, in her previous life, Emperor Gong didn't like her. Seeing that Qiu Xingfeng liked her, he let her go. So she became his disciple, but in this life, she didn't have the heart to disturb his life. She wondered if there was someone else like her who bumped into his arms in a daze. Yes, Qiu Xingfeng felt strange but still answered honestly. His eyes had a trace of longing. This time, I went to find her. That little girl didn't keep her word. She said she would come back in a month. She has been gone for half a year and hasn't come back to see me. His sad words made Gong Yimo's heart feel like it was being torn apart. She took a deep breath, and then another. However, Qiu Xingfeng could still sense her sadness. Moreover, he could sense that this lady was sad not because he had swapped the food, but because he had a disciple. Did she also want to be his disciple? That wouldn't do. Thinking of his little disciple's angry face, he said righteously, "If you want to be my disciple, then forget it. I already have a disciple. If you don't have anything else, I'll leave now." As he spoke, he made a gesture of preparing to leave. Gong Yimo couldn't hold back her tears, and they fell again. Because she was in a hurry, she didn't bother to disguise herself. Her face turned pale. She cried for a long time, but Qiu Xingfeng didn't leave. Finally, she seemed to have thought through something. She took out some food again and stuffed it all into his arms. Then, she flew onto the horse and rode past him to leave quickly. Qiu Xingfeng was a little stunned. He glanced at the strange girl's back. Not wanting to waste anything, he happily put all the food into the small bag. Looking at the bulging bag, his expression was satisfied, but he was a little embarrassed. That girl just now seemed very sad. So there were actually so many people who wanted to be his disciple. Thinking of this, he happily decided to tell this news to his little disciple. As for the girl just now, he would probably never see her again in this life. Gong Yimo was also thinking the same thing. In this lifetime, she would probably never go to Mount Yunding. Hence, it would be impossible for her to see Qiu Xingfeng again. In this life, without her interference, perhaps he would be happier. At least, he wouldn't end up like he did in his previous life. Just like that, she hastened her journey and soon arrived at the place where Gong Che had agreed to meet. Wancheng. At the same time, Gong Che was already waiting there. In the past few days, he had heard reports from his subordinates that Moa was nowhere to be seen. She must have disguised herself, which was why he could not find her. The meeting was scheduled to take place 3 days later at noon at the most famous restaurant in Wancheng City, WN Honglu. He wondered if he had guessed wrongly. With this thought in mind, Gong Che became even more anxious. 3 days slowly passed in this kind of anticipation and torment. Gong Yimo raised her head and looked at the 3 huge words WN Honglu. She was slightly surprised. In this restaurant, countless rich young talents gathered to discuss poetry and compose. Furthermore, the 10,000 words Zen tea was also the best. Hence, a rich young lady. A short man beside Gong Yimo was somewhat expectant and a little afraid. He also raised his head to look at the signboard and muttered, "Can I really go in?" This was a place where only rich talents could come. A poor scholar like him wouldn't be discovered and chased out, right? Gong Yimo said lightly, "What I asked you to memorize last night, you just have to memorize it. As for the rest, don't worry." As she spoke, she tossed a silver ingot to him. "This is the deposit." Looking at the silver ingot in his hand, the scholar Li Huai felt a lot more confident. He then went in. Immediately, a waiter came to receive him and he was led to the appointed room. Gong Yimo watched from behind with an indescribable expression. She was careless, but at this moment, she was cautious again. However, she didn't think too much about it. Instead, she felt that this matter was of great importance. If Gong Che came personally and she suddenly met him, how awkward would that be? However, perhaps he wouldn't be able to recognize her. Gong Yimo touched her face and felt a little more confident. The poor scholar Li Huai was led to an extremely luxurious private room. He looked around curiously, but remembered Gong Yimo's words and restrained himself. Not long after, a young man walked in. When he saw Li Huai, he first frowned and then sized him up with an inquisitive expression. "Nice to meet you. This humble one is Xu Yuan. May I know this brother's name?" Li Huai was somewhat at a loss as he hurriedly stood up and bowed. "This humble one is Li Huai. Greetings to young Master Xu." Gong Yimo was sitting in the hall downstairs. When she saw that the person who came was Xu Yuan, she couldn't help but feel a little surprised. Her eyes followed Xu Yuan up the stairs. She didn't expect that he was actually following Brother Crown Prince. She looked at herself and felt that Xu Yuan definitely wouldn't be able to see through her disguise. Why not meet him? However, after thinking about it, she decided to wait a little longer. When Xu Yuan saw Li Huai, he felt very disappointed. Of course, there was someone who was even more disappointed than him, and that was Gong Che, who had already arrived at the secret room next door. He had been sizing Li Huai up from the moment he came in, but he didn't see a trace of Mo-er on him. He originally thought that he was someone that Mo-er had sent to test him. Who knew that although this Li Huai looked timid, when he asked some questions, he spoke in an orderly manner and had quite the literary talent. In his disappointment, Gong Che stood up and left. When he was leaving, he passed by the hall. As he was feeling gloomy, he didn't raise his eyes to look. At this moment, a violent cough was heard. He subconsciously looked over and was shocked to find that the person's back seemed a little like Mo-er. He carefully stared at that person and took a few steps towards her. Who knew that in the next second, the person who was coughing suddenly slammed the table and scolded. "Waiter, come over here. Did you serve wine for this young master? I think it's horse piss." That vulgar and rough male voice disappointed Gong Che once again. His footsteps towards her stopped, then he flicked his sleeves and left without looking back. At this moment, the waiter came up with a wronged expression. "Sir, this is the best wine in the shop." When Gong Yimo saw that Gong Che had left, her tense back suddenly relaxed and she let out a long sigh of relief. Only the heavens knew that when she heard Gong Che's footsteps approaching, she was about to explode. Her small hands quickly patted her chest to relax, then she stuffed an ingot of silver into the waiter's hands. Sorry, I was just joking. I'm really sorry." Although the waiter was baffled by her apology and received the silver, he still left satisfied, leaving Gong Yimo lying on the table speechlessly. Gong Che, he really came. Chapter 193. Gong Yimo was extremely glad that she knew how to change her voice and that Gong Che didn't know about it. She cleverly waited downstairs for a while before going up. Otherwise, wouldn't she be caught red-handed? She didn't understand why she was afraid of Gong Che. No, she was subconsciously avoiding him. It was probably because his eyes were too sorrowful when she asked him to have a child soon. It left a lingering impression in her heart. After calming herself down, Gong Yimo stood up and walked upstairs. There were many details to be investigated regarding the cooperation. Li Huai could only hide it for a while. At this moment, Xu Yuan also sensed something. However, he only felt that Kim Yoon didn't have a good eye for people, so he sent someone like Li Huai. At this moment, someone knocked on the door. Li Huai heaved a sigh of relief and said, "Young Master Xu, please don't be impatient. My lord is here." Xu Yuan's eyes widened. He subconsciously wanted to ask the attendant waiting outside to report to the Crown Prince. However, on second thought, the person who came might not be Gong Yimo. If that was the case, wouldn't the crown prince be happy for nothing? Thus, he endured it and eagerly waited for Shu Yuan to open the door. As expected, he was disappointed again. The person who came was a dark-skinned young master. His appearance, temperament, and height were all different from the princess. When Gong Yimo saw Shu Yuan, she hurriedly greeted him. Throughout the process, she maintained her male identity. Her actions were flawless. Then, she saw the anticipation in his eyes disappear bit by bit. "Young Master Shi, why didn't you come in with Brother Li just now? Instead, you came in one after the other." After sitting down, Shu Yuan couldn't help but ask. Gong Yimo, who was also known as He Yu, smiled. "Something came up and I couldn't leave. My apologies, my apologies." Shu Yuan was disappointed that he didn't get anything out of her. However, he still asked with a trace of luck. "Young master, is there anyone else on this trip?" Gong Yimo said calmly, "We're in a hurry. It's just me and Brother Li." Shu Yuan didn't harp on this question. After all, what they were going to discuss next wasn't something glorious. The fewer people there were, the better. After that, Li Huai had nothing to do, so Gong Yimo let him leave. "Brother Li, you should return to the relay station first." As she spoke, she stuffed another ingot of silver into his hands. She winked at him and said, "On the way here, I saw that the second stall on the left of Nongchang Alley had good paintings. It's a pity that I didn't make it in time and couldn't stay. Buy them all. Bring them all to bring them back." Li Huai's face flushed red, because she was talking about his own stall. Thus, he hurriedly lowered his head, took the silver, and left. As he closed the door, he turned back to take a look and saw the two people in front of him beginning to talk. They were obviously dressed very low-key, but their words and actions, their expressions, and their mannerisms were clearly not ordinary people. This kind of people, he actually had the chance to come into contact with them. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but slowly close the door. Next, it was time for Gong Yimo and Shu Yuan to discuss business. The amount of money for smuggling, the amount of manpower and material resources each side would contribute, and the number of troops each side would send, had to be written down one by one on paper. This was because the details of this discussion would be handed over to the leaders of both sides, so there was no room for carelessness. However, Gong Yimo knew that the crown prince wasn't as rich as Kim Yoon. So, she intentionally or unintentionally went easy on him. In the end, the profits were split 40 to 60. But it didn't matter. Kim Yoon had her, so he wouldn't lose out. By the end of the conversation, Shu Yuan had completely forgotten about looking for Gong Yimo. His whole person was attracted by the other party's calm conversation, and the incisive words that came out from time to time. He could feel the other party's concession. Her free and easy mind and extraordinary bearing made Shu Yuan sigh with emotion. She was also a person with amazing talent. At the end, he stood up and bowed deeply. "Thank you, young master. I'll pass this brief discussion to my master. I hope that young master can stay in WN City for a few more days. When the time comes, you can return with my master's handwritten letter." At this point, he was a little worried and raised his head to ask in embarrassment. "May I ask, young master, can you make the decision on behalf of your country's second prince?" Gong Yimo smiled confidently, then took out a private seal from her chest. The two words Kim Yoon were especially clear on it. He didn't expect Yuheng's second prince to trust this person so much. This surprised Shu Yuan, but at the same time, he also felt relieved. "So it is. I'll go back and report." Shu Yuan excitedly took his leave. "I won't disturb young master." Gong Yimo stood up and returned the greeting. "I hope that this matter can be settled in the next few days so that I can return to report." Shu Yuan smiled and said, "Definitely. My master also attaches great importance to this matter. He will definitely reply to you as soon as possible." Gong Yimo smiled and said, "Then I won't see you off. Goodbye." After Shu Yuan left, Gong Yimo collapsed on the chair as if she had lost all her strength. She clutched her chest and trembled. She kept shouting in her heart that she was so nervous, so nervous. At the same time, she was secretly delighted. Even Shu Yuan couldn't recognize her. Perhaps Brother Crown Prince couldn't recognize her either. What she didn't expect was that not only was the Crown Prince in WN City, but a certain Prince Qi was also on his way here. However, he had encountered some trouble. Your Highness, Wang City is just ahead. At this speed, we will reach WN City in the evening of the day after tomorrow. Although Gong Dai was already a prince, he wasn't even 15 yet, so everyone still called him Your Highness. Gong Dai's lips curled up happily. He could feel that he was getting closer and closer to the royal sister. At this moment, a horse galloped in their direction. On the horse's back, a woman wearing a fiery red riding uniform shouted loudly, "Brother Ju, wait for me." Gong Dai heard the voice from afar and was a little impatient. Feeling the low pressure coming from the palanquin, Lo Chi hurriedly increased his speed. However, how could a group of people be faster than a single person? Soon, the woman caught up. "Brother Ju, why didn't you wait for me?" Blocking the carriage, although the woman was a little afraid of the aura of the person in the carriage, she still straightened her neck and blocked there. However, the horse under her was a little uneasy and kicked on the spot. Perhaps a beast's sense of danger was much stronger than a human's. Seeing that His Highness didn't have any intention to speak and seemed to be very unhappy, Lo Chi sighed and said, "Princess Zhaoqing, His Highness still has an urgent matter. I hope Princess Zhaoqing will move aside." Princess Zhaoqing, who was also Long Hanyang, glared at Lo Chi when she heard this. "Wherever you are going, I will also go. Bring me along." This wasn't something that Lo Chi could decide, so he shut his mouth and didn't speak again. At this moment, Gong Dai's extremely cold voice came from the carriage. "Move aside." Hearing that it was really Gong Dai's voice, Long Hanyang was overjoyed. Her imperial grandmother didn't lie to her. Chapter 194. Long Hanyang was the Empress Dowager's niece. Because her parents died early and she was weak and sickly, she was raised by the Empress Dowager. She doted on her very much and even requested the emperor to confer her the title of Princess Zhaoqing. But later on, her health deteriorated. In order to nurse her back to health, the Empress Dowager entrusted her niece to the perfected Yunding Mountain when he came to visit Dai Yu State's palace. It was only half a year ago that she returned to Dai Yu State. When she returned, the Empress Dowager was overjoyed. Especially when she saw that her health had improved, she was even happier. So even if her behavior was like a woman of the pugilistic world, she did not restrain her. Moreover, seeing that she was already 16, she hurriedly wanted to find a husband for her. Who knew that she did not fancy anyone but fell for Gong Dai at first glance. This person made the women in the capital somewhat afraid when they mentioned him. He had raided too many houses, and whenever he raided their houses, the fate of these women was especially tragic. So in front of fear, their feelings for his little girl faded and only fear was left. However, Long Hanyang relied on the Empress Dowager's favor and chased him several times. This time, she even chased him out of the palace. If they were in the palace, Gong Dai might still give her some face. But now outside the palace, Gong Dai slightly narrowed his eyes. If she did not know how to appreciate favors, although it would be troublesome, it was not impossible to make a move. Seeing that Gong Dai was so heartless to let her leave and was not the least bit moved, Long Hanyang was somewhat discouraged and also somewhat indignantly raised her neck. "I won't let you." She was a chivalrous woman, not those unmarried women in the capital. She was not afraid of him. Who knew that a short sword would suddenly shoot out from the sedan? It was too fast and she was completely caught off guard. In the end, when the short sword pierced the horse's body, the horse below her gave a sad cry and immediately jumped out. Long Hanyang was caught off guard and tightly grasped the reins. She turned around and saw the carriages continue to move forward. She hurriedly let go of her hand and used Qinggong to land on the ground. However, she deliberately twisted her foot and fell to the ground. She cried loudly, "Aya! Ninth brother, Wu Wu, my leg is broken." Lo Chi took a look and was somewhat hesitant. But only one cold word from Gong Dai rang out from the carriage. "Let's go." Even if he fell to his death, he wouldn't turn around to look, let alone break his neck. Seeing that the carriage didn't stop, and that her Qinggong wasn't good enough to catch up to the horse, She couldn't help but hammer the ground in frustration. I don't believe it. I can't catch you. Wancheng Manor. Hearing Xu Yuan's report and his high evaluation of that person, Gong Che looked at him strangely. That Li Huai looks very ordinary to me. Who would have thought that he would catch your eye? Xu Yuan slapped his head and laughed. Look at me. Wrong, it's not the Li Huai from before, it's someone else. Gong Che quickly asked, the other one? He asked anxiously, who is it? Knowing what the Crown Prince was worried about, Xu Yuan couldn't help but lower his head. Your Highness, it's a Mr. He was delayed by some matters and only arrived later. Although he is young, he is very talented and speaks well. Moreover, he has the private seal of the second Prince of Yuheng. Obviously, he is highly valued by him. Gong Che didn't give up and asked, are you sure it's a man? Xu Yuan sighed in his heart and said, I'm sure. Gong Che frowned slightly. Moa, she really didn't come? Thinking of this, his heart was filled with grief and he almost couldn't breathe. He had waited for her for so long. Why didn't she appear? Didn't she know how much he missed her? How could she be so heartless and leave just like that? She left so casually. She didn't even send him a single letter in the past year. Gong Dai was dejected. He took the detailed list from Xu Yuan's hand and looked at it, then pulled himself together. Moa values transportation the most. The shipyard she left behind is still in operation. I'm only looking after it. If she comes back, she definitely won't let that place go. After he seemed to be talking to himself, he lowered his head and seriously looked at the detailed list in his hand. He had to control the flow of these routes. Then, Moa would appear sooner or later. Thinking of this, his eyes lit up again. It was as if he had entered a demon's trap, unable to extricate himself. Seeing Gong Che like this, Xu Yuan couldn't help but sigh faintly. Who would have thought that the Crown Prince would have such feelings for his own sister? At first, they only thought that the Crown Prince was overly good to the princess. But they didn't expect that this kind of kindness didn't come from kinship. In the latter half of the night, Gong Che and a few of his confidants discussed for half the night and finally came up with a plan. Then, he stamped his private seal. As long as Kim Yoon stamped his private seal, this matter would be considered a success. But there were some details that needed to be discussed again, so Xu Yuan once again arranged to meet with Gong Yimo. On Gong Dai's side, they had already reached the border of Wan City. That night, they set up camp in the suburbs and the carriages started to rest. At this moment, a figure was slowly approaching. It was still Long Hanyang. She wouldn't give up so easily. She believed that Gong Dai was the same towards everyone and not only towards her. Thinking of this, her heart became even more fervent as she stared at Gong Dai's carriage with infatuation. She also didn't expect that she would fall in love with Gong Dai. He was so cold towards others and his murderous aura was so strong. The first time she met him, it was when she had just returned to the capital. At that time, she was riding a horse past a mansion. But that mansion was very noisy and was surrounded by the imperial guards. She could only hear the sound of crying. Out of curiosity, she secretly used her Qinggong to sneak a peek. It turned out that this family had committed a crime and had been searched. At that time, she was lying on the outermost wall, using a tree to cover her body as she watched the imperial guards going in and out. From time to time, people would be dragged out and from time to time, things would be moved out. It was very busy. But the entire process was very orderly. Other than the cries of the people in the mansion, the imperial guards didn't make any sound. They were like puppets, quietly doing their own things and coldly obeying orders. It made her forget about the sympathy she had for this family and was only left with shock. Long Hanyang hid there and her heart was suddenly curious about who their leader was. With such a strict troop, their leader must be even more formidable. At this moment, she saw Gong Dai. Gong Dai held a thick account book in his hand as he calmly walked from the backyard to the front yard. From time to time, people would cry and be dragged away by his side. He didn't look sideways and only stared at the account book in his hand as he revealed a faint smile. It was as if the scene was being searched from time to time and there was no one else around. He was just a scholar taking advantage of the winter sun to come out for a walk. In his hand was a book of poems and not an account book. He was extremely beautiful, but what attracted Long Hanyang the most was his unique aura. With a faint disdainful attitude, he calmly and coldly wandered around the world. Chapter 195. Therefore, as soon as he appeared, she saw him at a glance and could no longer avert her eyes. At this time, a woman was dragged out of the door. She cried and struggled desperately, especially when she saw Gong Dai. She didn't know where the strength came from, but she broke away from the Imperial Guard and directly threw herself at Gong Dai's feet, holding his feet tightly. Gong Dai's eyes finally moved from the account book to her. His eyes were cold, and he looked at her with lowered eyebrows. The cold feeling he gave off was like a good young master in a chaotic world, not a big villain who came to search and destroy the family. The woman looked at him and sobbed painfully. "Your Highness, please let me go. I don't want to go to the musical house. Please." She cried heartbreakingly, which was not beautiful at all. However, Gong Dai just stared at her indifferently, unmoved. At this time, the woman seemed to throw caution to the wind. She wiped her face with her sleeves and looked up. "Or I beg your Highness to accept me. I can be a slave or a maid. I can do anything." She tried to make herself look better, but the face swollen from crying was not beautiful at all. The Imperial Guard who was holding her saw that Gong Dai didn't move, so he didn't dare to act rashly. He only dared to stand aside and watch. However, he saw Gong Dai bend down and help the woman up. The woman was flattered and panicked. She sobbed and looked at him with a pair of eyes full of horror. She didn't dare to make a sound, but her eyes were gradually bursting with expectation. However, she was pushed into the arms of the Imperial Guard by Gong Dai. "Send her to the musical house. Your Excellency." The woman's beautiful face turned pale and she let out a miserable cry. But this time, she was held tightly and directly dragged away. It was an extremely cruel act, but Long Hanyang didn't feel disgusted when she saw it. Especially when he stretched out his hand, someone handed him a snow-white handkerchief. He carefully wiped his hands. His fingers were long and slender, and his fingertips seemed to glow under the sunlight. He was elegant and calm, cold and noble, mesmerizing. Perhaps in his heart, he would find excuses for his actions. Clearly, he could change a woman's fate with a single sentence, but he didn't do so. He must have his reasons. At least, that was what Long Hanyang thought back then. She fell in love at first sight and swore to marry him, no matter what his status was. Later, the Empress Dowager found out about her thoughts. Not only did she not object, but she was also somewhat happy. At that time, the niece that she originally wanted to marry Gong Dai had been seduced and eloped. So much so that she no longer had the face to mention marriage to Gong Dai. But when she saw Long Hanyang, her mind became active again, and she supported her initiative. She even promised that no matter what happened, she would help Long Hanyang clean up the mess. As a result, her courage grew bigger and bigger, and in her mind, an unbelievable idea was born. The forest was quiet. Long Hanyang hid behind a bush. Because of that thought, her heart was pounding. Her ears were filled with the sound of her blood vessels spurting out. Suddenly, there were people approaching from afar, and there were quite a number of them. Lo Chi and the rest immediately became alert and led people to welcome them. But these people were just mountain villagers whom Long Hanyang had spent a lot of money to invite. When they saw people chasing after them, they turned around and ran, which made Lo Chi feel very strange. Then, a faint smoke filled the air. Long Hanyang proudly thought that this was the self-made knockout incense on Yunding Mountain. She didn't believe that it couldn't knock them out. Sure enough, the remaining people who stayed behind to guard fell to the ground and couldn't get up. This time, there was no one to obstruct her. Long Hanyang hurriedly ran out, and before those people returned, she quickly ran towards the horse carriage. She had obviously made up her mind. But when she really reached the horse carriage, she hesitated. Her face was flushed red, as if she was a little excited and a little scared. If she really used the drug and offered herself, Gong Dai, would he marry her? Would he have no choice but to marry her, or would he treat her like that woman? Not knowing why, Long Hanyang suddenly thought of the woman who was sent to the musical house when they first met. She cried so miserably at that time, and looked at Gong Dai with eyes full of disbelief, which then turned into fear, despair, and resentment. At the moment when she was dragged out of the door, the woman's eyes almost shed tears of blood. The sharp and hoarse voice made her, who was peeping at that time, feel numb. Gong Dai, I curse you to die a horrible death. I curse you. You can't get what you want, and you'll be miserable for the rest of your life. After death, you'll be burned by the fire of karma. I curse you. Long Hanyang thought of her ferocious eyes when she said this sentence, and couldn't help but tremble, and became more hesitant. But looking at the horse carriage in front of her, she made up her mind. Anyway, she had come to this point, and she had no way to retreat. Thinking of this, she suddenly lifted the curtain of the horse carriage. Under the moonlight, Gong Dai's figure was illuminated, but at this time, he was not knocked out by the smoke, but opened his eyes and looked at her coldly. Long Hanyan's eyes widened in horror. Then, before she could open her mouth, Gong Dai reached out and grabbed her neck. No, Long Hanyang hurriedly tried to pry his hand away, but that hand was like cast iron and did not move an inch. She opened her mouth again, but could only make a broken sound. What was going on? She was the princess. How dare he? In the capital, although he spoke to her harshly, he did not want to kill her. At this time, he grabbed Long Hanyan's neck with one hand and slowly leaned out of the sedan chair. His slender figure made Long Hanyan's feet leave the ground, and her whole body was sobbing in pain. He looked at her, and at this angle, the moonlight could only illuminate half of his face, making half of his face handsome like an immortal, and the other half because of the darkness, indescribable expression. This person was clearly the devil. He was not what she thought at all. Unfortunately, this understanding was too late. Long Hanyan's eyes rolled back, and she felt that she was going to die. He really did not hesitate to kill her. Why? She just wanted to marry him. At this time, there was a sudden burst of energy. Gong Dai moved sideways slightly to avoid it, and Long Hanyang fell and landed in Cho Xing Feng's arms. God knows, he originally wanted to go to the capital to find her, but he did not expect to meet her here, and there was actually someone who wanted to kill him. Cho Xing Feng saw that Gong Dai's expression became angry, and thought that this must be a bad person. Long Hanyang coughed violently, and when she saw that the person who saved her was Cho Xing Feng, she hurriedly grabbed him and cried, "Woo, master. It hurts, my neck hurts." Her crying made Cho Xing Feng even angrier. "Who are you? Why do you want to kill my disciple?" But Gong Dai just stood in the carriage, and turned around. Because of the light, they could not see his expression, but they could feel his slightly probing gaze. This person, when he threw out a palm, the energy was actually very similar to the cultivation method that he and Royal Sister practiced. Chapter 196. Who are you? Gong Dai asked in a low voice. Cho Xing Feng snorted. I'm not telling you. Bad guy. Yang I'll teach him a lesson for you. Long Hanyang wanted to hold him back, but she thought that it would be good to let her master teach Gong Dai a lesson. She wanted him to know that she was not so easy to bully. Those who were chosen by her must obey obediently, so she hesitated for a while before letting go. She was very confident in Cho Xing Feng's martial arts. Although Cho Xing Feng's intelligence was not high, he was a martial arts genius. Not only did he cultivate the supreme technique of wind and nature, but he had already reached the fifth realm. Gong Dai could not possibly be his opponent. She was secretly hoping that her master could avenge her, but she was also afraid that her master would not control his strength and hurt him. After all, his intelligence was not high. As for Gong Dai winning, she did not think of this possibility. Very few people knew how good Gong Dai's martial arts were. Usually, he did not need to make a move and things would be settled. So he always gave people the impression that he was a cold and indifferent young master. And the incident in the Cold Palace had happened 5 or 6 years ago. So people gradually forgot that this person dared to break into the palace alone when he was only 9 years old and massacred the 3 stages. How could people forget his own danger because of his ruthless methods? So when Gong Dai and Cho Xing Feng exchanged blows, Long Hanyan's eyes widened in horror. She found that Gong Dai's strength was on par with her master's. They seemed to be using the same technique. And their realms were the same. How could it be? That was a technique unique to Mount Yunding, and her master was a martial arts genius. He had a famous teacher to teach him. Not only was he rich in resources, he also practiced hard every day to achieve what he had now. What did Gong Dai have? Was he just a prince that no one cared about in the cold palace? He was probably bullied every day and did not even have enough to eat. How could he be more powerful than her master? In the process of exchanging blows, Gong Dai naturally found out that their techniques were similar. He could not help but raise his eyebrows slightly. However, Qiu Xingfeng didn't care at all. He didn't consider this at all. He only felt that his opponent was extremely powerful. It made him feel as if he was facing his teacher. In terms of martial arts, Qiu Xingfeng was actually a little better. But Gong Dai was more ruthless than him. What was supposed to be a smooth martial art was actually extremely fierce when he used it. Therefore, the two of them were actually evenly matched in their battle, the two sides separated by a palm. Qiu Xingfeng retreated a few steps until he was in front of Long Hanyang, while Gong Ju flipped over and landed lightly on the carriage. Even the horse didn't move. It was actually a draw. Qiu Xingfeng felt that it was inconceivable. He panted slightly and realized that he actually didn't have the upper hand. This made him feel very defeated. How was he going to explain this to his little disciple? As for Long Hanyang, she was even more surprised. After being surprised, she was scared. If her master couldn't stop him, then she wouldn't be killed, right? When she thought of the suffocation she felt when he grabbed her by the throat and his undisguised killing intent, a gust of wind blew past, causing her body to tremble. The originally quiet forest was disturbed by the wind, and the leaves rustled. And Gong Dai looked down at them from above and spoke again. "Who are you?" This was the second time Gong Dai asked this question. But because he was equally matched with Qiu Xingfeng, this time, Qiu Xingfeng was much more honest and answered in a muffled voice. "I am Qiu Xingfeng. We are from Mount Yunding." Mount Yunding. Information about Mount Yunding flashed through Gong Dai's mind, but it was very little. The people there were very low-key and mysterious, but it was quite famous in the extreme south. "The martial art you used just now, is it unique to Mount Yunding?" Gong Dai asked again. This time, Qiu Xingfeng finally realized that the other party's martial art was the same as his. He couldn't help but be surprised. "Yes, but why do you know?" He looked suspiciously at Gong Dai. Could it be that he had a junior brother that he didn't know about? His words made Gong Dai ponder deeply. If it was really unique, then why did Royal Sister know the martial arts of Mount Yunding? And she knew everything about it. So Gong Dai didn't answer his question. Instead, he asked a strong question. "Do you know Gong Yimo?" Gong Yimo? Qiu Xingfeng and Long Hanyang muttered this name in their hearts. Qiu Xingfeng felt strange, while Long Hanyang felt angry. She didn't expect that one day, she would hear another woman's name from Gong Dai's mouth. Even though she had taken care of him since he was young, she still couldn't accept it. So she silently remembered this name that was widely known in Daiyu State. For the first time, she remembered it in her heart with some hatred. "I don't know her," Qiu Xingfeng answered. "You don't know her?" Gong Dai frowned slightly. He was most curious about Gong Yimo's background. She was too mysterious. She knew everything and knew everything. Also, she was broad-minded, as if nothing could be difficult for her. She wasn't afraid of anyone in the world. But where did she come from? Why was she different from all the women in the world? Seeing Qiu Xingfeng nod in a daze, Gong Dai's frown deepened. He suddenly felt a bit depressed. Forget it. One day, he would find out all the secrets of the royal sister. There was no need to rush. At this time, the others ran back. Seeing the people lying on the ground, they thought there were assassins and quickly became alert. When Lo Qi saw Princess Jiaoqing, who had obviously cried, he couldn't help but sigh. This woman really didn't understand their highness. In the capital, the only reason His Highness didn't do anything to her was because he didn't want to have a falling out with the Empress Dowager. She actually didn't know what was good for her and chased him all the way here. This time, His Highness probably wouldn't let her go. But who was the other young man? Was he also a helper that the princess spent money to hire? Long Hanyang was also a bit scared now. She felt that Gong Dai's gaze on her was murderous. So she slowly hid behind Qiu Xingfeng. She felt wronged and unreconciled. Qiu Xingfeng was also secretly on guard. This person gave him a very strong feeling. It wasn't martial arts, but a kind of hair-raising pressure. He had to be cautious. Who knew that Gong Dai would look at them and let them go? "You can go." After saying that, he sat back in the carriage, leaving the people present feeling a bit incredulous. Lo Qi and the others felt that His Highness wouldn't be so kind to people who offended him. Long Hanyang was even more so. Why did the person who wanted to kill her suddenly let her go? Only Qiu Xingfeng was very happy. He directly pulled Long Hanyang, who hadn't recovered from the shock, and left. As for Long Hanyang, she was in a daze. When she was being pulled away, she only felt the hair on her back stand up, as if she was being watched by something. She was well behaved, and even if she was unwilling, she did not dare to look back. Until their figures disappeared, Gong Dai opened a corner of the curtain and slightly narrowed his eyes. That man didn't look very old, and he looked very foolish. He probably didn't know anything about Sister Royal. However, they must be related to Sister Royal. Therefore, without knowing the truth, Sister Royal, he didn't kill. Chapter 197. When Gong Yimo received Xu Yuan's reply, she was put in a difficult position. In the letter, Gong Che wanted to meet her to show that he valued her. Gong Yimo touched her face. She was quite confident in her disguise. Forget it. It was a blessing, not a curse. If he recognized her, so be it. So, she agreed to meet him. It was the same private room in Wn Hong restaurant. The same scene made her slightly nervous. The moment she opened the door, Gong Yimo felt a strong gaze on her. That gaze was prying, expectant, and many other complicated emotions. She paused and looked over. Gong Che was the only one sitting at the tea table in the room. Xu Yuan wasn't here, and this made her even more cautious. She hurriedly bowed. "You must be the Crown Prince of Dai Yu State. You are indeed extraordinary. I am Shi Yu. Greetings, Your Highness." Gong Che's gaze was locked on her. He did not look away even after hearing her speak. He only pointed at the table in front of him. "Please sit." When he said this, there was an unnoticeable tremor in his voice. Gong Yimo felt uncomfortable being stared at by him, but she still sat down. Her posture was very casual. There was a simple aura of someone who had traveled extensively. It made people feel close to her. However, there was no trace of Gong Yimo in her. She was clearly a man. Gong Che was disappointed, but he was also filled with a strong sense of indignation as he looked at her again and again. Gong Yimo touched her face subconsciously and asked in a very masculine voice, "Why is Your Highness looking at me like this? Is there something wrong with my face?" Gong Che only looked away when she said this. His eyes dimmed slightly. Gong Yimo sighed in her heart. Although more than a year had passed, her brother Crown Prince had not changed much. He was handsome and gentle. The only difference was that there was a faint sadness between his brows. It made people want to drive away the sadness in his heart and smooth out the wrinkles between his brows. "I'm sorry," Gong Che said in a low voice. There was an imperceptible pain in his voice. Regardless of whether the person in front of him was Gong Yimo or not, her refusal to see him, or her refusal to see him with her real face, made his chest hurt and he felt a little breathless. Why did he miss her so much? "It's all right." Gong Yimo grinned and quickly got down to business. "I heard that Your Highness still has some matters to discuss with this humble one. May I know what they are?" Gong Che glanced at her and sighed inwardly as he spoke. "It's about logistics. Sir, once the two countries start trading privately, I wonder if your logistics department is trustworthy?" Gong Yimo's heart skipped a beat. She smiled and said, "Of course. Do you have any suggestions, Your Highness?" Gong Che suddenly looked at her and said, "I would like to merge the logistics of the two countries and put one person in charge. This way, we can save a lot of unnecessary trouble. Do you think it's feasible?" Gong Yimo was stunned and said hesitantly, "After all, it's two countries. If one fleet is in charge, I'm afraid it will be difficult to convince the public. After all, is it better to be someone from Dayu State or someone from Yuheng State? Gong Che heard her and said indifferently, "My subordinates are full of praise for Sir. I'm sure Sir must be very wealthy. Sir can tell us about this. If we want to do this, what should we do?" Was he throwing the difficult problem to her again? Gong Yimo smiled and said, "The people and ships can be split in half by each country. It's just that the person in charge." Gong Che suddenly looked at her expectantly. "What about the person in charge?" Gong Yimo blinked and said with a smile, "Since Your Highness has this suggestion, can this humble one recommend the person in charge?" "You?" Gong Che's eyes flashed. "You are Yuheng's trusted aide, but not my trusted aide. How can I trust you?" Gong Yimo smiled. "Your Highness, please don't be impatient. Listen to me." She personally poured a cup of tea for Gong Che. In terms of benefits, Dayu State has a large territory and abundant resources. The trade with Dayu State has more advantages than disadvantages for Yuheng. Therefore, we will not do anything to break the treaty. Gong Che just drank his tea and did not say anything. Secondly, although this humble one is highly regarded by the second prince, I have traveled extensively for many years and consider myself a fair and peaceful person. I have a broad vision and will definitely not kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. As she spoke, she suddenly raised her head with a smile and slyly glanced at the unmoved Gong Che as she spoke. Of course, the most important thing is that someone told this humble one that she can improve ships and expand the fleet. She also handed this item to me and said that if necessary, I can show it to Your Highness. As she said this, Gong Yimo took out an item from her sleeve. Gong Che took a look and saw that it was a dagger studded with gems. "This is..." He grabbed the dagger excitedly. This dagger was originally a gift he wanted to give to Gong Dai when he went to the West Continent. However, he and Moa went on a boat to the lake and, so many things happened. He left in a hurry and the box containing the dagger was left on the boat. He did not expect it to be here. In other words, this was Moa's idea. He carefully sized up the smiling and mature man in front of him. Who was he to Moa? Was he her subordinate? Gong Che held the dagger and said in a slightly anxious tone, "You said that there is no problem with being the manager, but where is the owner of this dagger? I want to see her." Gong Yimo smiled. "She is not in Dayu State. Sorry to disappoint you." As expected, Gong Che looked disappointed. He muttered to himself for a long time and suddenly asked, "Did she have anything else to say? Other than this?" Looking at his eager eyes, Gong Yimo suddenly felt uncomfortable. She sighed. She said, "If you meet again, will you agree to be brother and sister again?" She should not have said this, but when she saw his face turn pale, she felt even more uncomfortable. Brother and sister? Gong Che looked at her and then at the dagger. After a long time, he smiled bitterly. "I will agree to be the manager. However, I also hope that you can pass on a message for me." Gong Yimo gestured for him to go ahead. Her movements were flawless. Gong Che looked at her as if he was looking at someone else through her. Finally, he sighed helplessly. "Please tell her that it doesn't matter what relationship she wants, as long as she comes back." Gong Yimo was stunned again. She could not tell what she was feeling. After a long time, she came back to her senses and said in a muffled voice, "I will definitely pass on the message." After saying this, Gong Yimo tried to change the topic and talk to him about something else. During this time, Gong Che kept looking at her with a deep and probing gaze. It made her feel uncomfortable. Soon, she got up to leave. "Will Sir be leaving tonight?" Before leaving, Gong Che raised his teacup and asked. Gong Yimo nodded. "This matter cannot be delayed. I will leave tonight." Gong Che did not say anything. He just stood up and smiled. "In that case, I will send you off. Please." Chapter 198. At this time, the sky was gradually darkening. Gong Yimo and Gong Che walked side by side on the streets, each with their own thoughts. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Gong Yimo pondered. Now, her disguise skills were not just a little better than before. Moreover, she could imitate the charm that was once the most difficult to conceal to perfection now, so there shouldn't be a problem. But when she thought of how Gong Che recognized her at a glance at Gong Dai's celebratory banquet, she felt a little uncertain. Thinking of this, they had unknowingly walked to the edge of the city. Gong Yimo heaved a sigh of relief and bowed to Gong Che. "Thank you, Crown Prince, for sending me off. But in the end, we must part. In the future, we will still meet again." She lowered her head, but after a while, Gong Che spoke again. "Sir, didn't someone come with you earlier? Where did that Sir Li go?" Gong Yimo raised her head, her expression unchanged. This matter went smoothly. This lowly one asked him to go back and report the good news. Gong Che nodded and pointed to the city wall. "It's still early. Would Sir be willing to tour the city gate with me?" Gong Yimo paused and glanced at the city wall. She smiled and said, "Then this lowly one will be disrespectful to refuse." She felt that her face was about to stiffen from smiling. She followed behind Gong Che, who was deep in thought, and walked up the city gate tower. She muttered to herself, did he find out or not? Or was it because she was too anxious and took out the dagger for the exclusive fleet, so it aroused his suspicion? Only when the two of them reached the top of the city wall and the cool summer wind blew did Gong Yimo feel refreshed. At this time, Gong Che finally spoke. "Do you know, if she was here now, what would I do?" He didn't use the word I, but used the word I. This made Gong Yimo's heart skip a beat. "What would you do?" Gong Che suddenly looked at her. The people on the city wall had all retreated because of their arrival, but the torches illuminated his pupils, giving off a mysterious feeling. "I will hug her and never let her leave." His words made Gong Yimo pause, not knowing how to answer. Seeing that she was in a difficult position, he grinned. "I'm just kidding. I won't do anything." As he spoke, he looked away and sighed softly with his hand on the city wall. "How could I bear to do anything to hurt her?" Gong Yimo listened to Gong Che's gentle and serious tone and suddenly felt a little guilty. As a member of the Shiryu family, she did not know how to respond, so she listened quietly. Perhaps Gong Che just wanted her to pass on a message. He raised his head to look at the moon, leaving behind an exquisite side profile, gentle and mature. This kind of him could easily make the hearts of some young girls palpitate, such as her in the past. While Gong Yimo was lost in her thoughts, Gong Che sighed faintly. "If she's here, I just want to tell her that I miss her very much." Gong Yimo finally couldn't help but say, "She's your sister." He laughed. "Many people have said this to me before." He looked at Gong Yimo in a daze, as though he was looking at another person through her. "Sir, have you ever liked anyone before?" Gong Yimo couldn't help but think of her previous life. In her previous life, at the beginning, she liked him very much, very much. However, the flames of war and killing later on had erased all her feelings, including love. She didn't hate him, so naturally, she didn't love him. Therefore, she said softly, "I liked someone before." Gong Che smiled faintly. "I didn't expect Sir to be such a sentimental person." "Then, Sir, you must be able to understand my feelings." He looked dazed, as though he was very lost. "It's a kind of, sometimes tossing and turning, sometimes feeling as though I'm in the clouds, sometimes heartache, and sometimes missing someone deeply. I didn't understand this feeling in the past, but later on, I did. It's just that the person who made me understand was my sister." What a coincidence. Gong Yimo was speechless. If only she was here. I really want to ask her why she hasn't sent a single letter for more than a year. Is she afraid? Or is she disgusted? I don't know. Every time I think about it, I feel extremely pained. He clenched his hand into a fist and gently knocked on his chest. Although there was a smile at the corner of his mouth, there was an unresolvable sadness around him, as though another soul was crying. His eyelashes fluttered as he closed his eyes. If she was here, I want to tell her that if the price of confessing is never to see her again, then I hope she can forget that day. I will also forget that day and let everything start anew. His words made Gong Yimo's heart move. Was he really willing to forget everything and start anew? Seeing that she was deep in thought, Gong Che stared at her with a burning gaze. In the depths of his eyes, there seemed to be a fire burning. Would he really forget everything and start anew? No. No, no. Only by tying her to his side would he have a chance. He was in too much pain, and he longed for it too much. He felt that he was going to die if he didn't have her by his side. So as long as she was by his side, even if he could see her every day, it would be a form of relief. So he showed his weakest side to the person in front of him, expressing all his sadness. He knew that Mo-er was very free and easy, but she was also the most soft-hearted. She could be persuaded by reason, but not cowed by force. So as long as the person in front of him was her, she would definitely reveal a flaw. He had to carefully endure, for the sake of a result that he longed for. Gong Yimo was stared at by him. She didn't know why, but even though it was a heartwarming scene, she felt the hair on her back stand up. She shook her head and sighed. Your Highness is very affectionate. Although I can't understand, I will still pass on your words. As she said that, she glanced at Gong Che. It's just a pity that she's not here. Her words made Gong Che smile bitterly. Is she not here this time because she hates me? Gong Yimo smiled. Although I'm not a woman, I can see that she doesn't hate you. Then, what kind of feelings does she have for me? Gong Che's eyes suddenly brightened. His body tensed up, restraining himself from pulling the other into his arms, vividly expressing his infatuated and bitterly longing feelings. Gong Yimo couldn't bear it, but she still said resolutely, I might be able to guess some of her thoughts. In my opinion, she won't stay for anyone. Why? Gong Che said anxiously. Even if she wants to do something, it won't be a hindrance if she's with me. I won't bring her any trouble. I'll even help her and support her. She can do anything she wants. Even if I have to go against the entire country, I'll still stand by her side. Gong Yimo thought, then why didn't you help or support me in my previous life? Why did you betray the world and stand by my side? This thought only lasted for a moment. She knew in her heart that different experiences would lead to different people's hearts and results. However, even if she forgot about the hurt and didn't care about it, there would still be a shadow. That was why she resisted. She once told me that she doesn't believe in love in the world. She thinks that it's just an illusion that can't withstand the waves. That's why she doesn't want to marry. This sentence is true, and she treats everyone equally. Chapter 199. Gong Yimo took a step back and bowed. It's late, I should be on my way. There's no need for your highness to send me off. Gong Che looked at her deeply, unable to speak for a long time. He was almost certain that the person in front of him was Gong Yimo. Why did she refuse to admit it? Why did she want to leave? This unrequited desire stimulated the impulse that he had painstakingly suppressed to the point of erupting. He really wanted to pull the person in front of him into his arms and never let her leave again, but before he could say anything, the sound of hooves could be heard from afar. A group of carriages hurried over. Gong Che immediately recognized the person from the heavy black carriages and the iconic 6 red horses. Gong Dai. It was Gong Dai. Gong Yimo naturally saw Gong Dai's carriage as well. She immediately panicked. She didn't know why, but she wasn't afraid of anyone. But when she thought of how Gong Dai had cut his wrist and bled, she was afraid. But she still pretended to be calm and smiled at Gong Che. It seems that your highness has a friend. There's no need for me to send you off. Farewell. Although Gong Che really wanted to find out her true identity, Gong Dai's arrival had caught him off guard. He definitely didn't want Gong Dai to see Gong Yimo, so he gestured to someone behind him. Immediately, someone appeared in front of Gong Yimo and knelt on one knee. Hearing the sound of hooves approaching, Gong Che didn't have time to say anything. No matter how reluctant he was, he could only endure it. Don't worry, I'll let the shadow guards take him around the city first. Nothing will happen, just bear with it a little longer. But the words that came out were spoken through gritted teeth. Ying Feng, send Sir out through the side door. Ying Feng looked up at Gong Che. Yes. Gong Yimo raised her head and smiled at Gong Che. Goodbye. With that, she followed Eagle Peak down the city walls. At the same time, Gong Dai's carriage arrived at the city gates. Because Gong Che had sent everyone away, no one came to open the door for Gong Dai. After a year, the two of them met for the first time. Who would have thought that they would be in such a stalemate? Lo Chi whispered something at the window of the carriage. A moment later, the curtain was lifted, and the slender figure of Gong Dai strode out. He raised his head and saw that Gong Che was the only one left on the wall. "Royal brother, why did you close the city gates and stop me from entering?" When Gong Che heard this, he waved his hand again. After sending someone to call for the soldiers guarding the city, he looked down at Gong Dai's hateful face and felt extremely indignant. Why did he come? He was so close to finding out if that person was Moa or not. Therefore, he really couldn't bring himself to smile, and said in an extremely bad tone, "Brother, please wait for a moment." Seeing him like this, Gong Dai narrowed his eyes. Lo Chi had said that he saw someone talking to the crown prince on the city walls from afar, but that person left as soon as he arrived. It was a very normal thing, but he found it strange. Who was that person? Could it be someone sent by Yu Heng? Could it be royal sister? Thinking of this, he became excited and looked up at Gong Che. "Dare I ask, royal brother, who was the other person on the city walls? Why did he leave in such a hurry?" Gong Che's heart skipped a beat. "Just a friend. You don't know him. Could he be Yu Heng's friend?" Gong Dai sneered. "Impudent." Gong Che was suddenly enraged. "Are you saying that I colluded with outsiders?" Gong Dai's eyes curved into crescents. "Isn't that so?" Gong Che was annoyed. After a while, he said, "It's late now. I'll hold a welcoming dinner for royal brother tomorrow. Goodbye." As he spoke, he hurriedly left. Unexpectedly, Gong Ju leapt up from the carriage and landed in front of Gong Che at the city gate with a few clicks of his feet. His black robes and black hair were a stark contrast to Gong Che's moon-colored robes. At this moment, his eyes were smiling, and there was a kind of evilness to them. "Royal brother, where are you going in such a hurry?" Gong Che's heart was vaguely anxious. Just now, he had asked the shadow guard to send the person out of the side door, but there was no side door in WN City. Therefore, the shadow guard must have understood his meaning and detained the person in the city. So he had to find him, find out who he was. But Gong Dai was here, and he really didn't want to reveal any flaws. He was afraid that Moa would be found by Gong Dai first. "It's late. I want to return to the residence." "Is that so?" Gong Dai didn't back down. He could sense Gong Che's panic. He was definitely hiding something. And this matter was related to him, so it could only be because of his royal sister. "Where's the person you saw just now? Is she also in your residence?" "Gong Dai." Gong Che was a little angry. "I'm the crown prince. You have no right to question me." "Oh." At this moment, many of Gong Dai's men had climbed up the city gates and stood beside Gong Dai. Gong Che's hidden guards also appeared. Both sides were eyeing each other covetously, and the atmosphere was very tense. In terms of numbers, Gong Dai had a little more. At this moment, he was no longer smiling, but his face darkened. His usually cold eyes were even colder now. "Royal brother, you know why I'm here. Tell me, where is she?" And Gong Che wasn't afraid of him. So what if he had more people? Would he dare to kill him? "I don't know." His coldness caused Gong Ju's body to erupt with murderous intent. It was just like how Gong Che found Gong Dai an eyesore, but in Gong Dai's eyes, there was no one more annoying than Gong Che. The royal sister was his to begin with. Gong Che just had to stick his nose into it. How despicable. Just as the stalemate was about to break out, a signal firework suddenly exploded in the air. It was fiery red, and seemed to be in extreme danger. Gong Che cursed inwardly. Oh no. He actually ran past Gong Dai and headed in the direction of the firework. Setting off the firework was a way for Gong Che's men to send signals, and the firework just now was exclusive to Eagle Peak. There was only one reason why he would set off the firework, and that was because the person had disappeared. Moa must have sensed something and escaped after shaking off the shadow guards. He was too careless. Moa was such a smart person. How could she not know the details of WN City before coming here? She must have known that there was no side door in WN City. So now, he really didn't have the mood to deal with Gong Dai and chased after her. Gong Dai stood on the city wall and looked in the direction of the firework. After a long time, he revealed a smile. This smile was beautiful and different from his usual cold smile. This time, The smile extended from his heart to his eyes. Royal sister. She's really in Wan City. That's great. As long as she's here, I'll definitely be able to find her. Gong Yimo sighed inwardly at her bad luck. Gong Che was already hard enough to deal with, so why is Gong Dai here too? Shouldn't he still be in the palace getting rid of dissidents? With this thought, she wiped off the disguise on her face as she ran. She took off her outer clothes and threw them into her space to change her appearance. But now, she was surrounded by Gong Che and Gong Dai. Could she escape? Chapter 200. At this moment, there was not a single person on the streets. If she walked out, she would be too eye-catching. Moreover, the entire Wan City was probably surrounded by Gong Che. If she wanted to leave, it would be difficult. Thinking of this, she was not in a hurry. Anyway, she had Gong Che's handwritten letter and the additional regulations stamped with his personal seal. Once she left the city, she could immediately contact her shipyard to start building a fleet. At that time, she could just send a manager who was proficient in the water to deal with the smuggling business. She would go and do something else. She did not want to be involved in these matters. Love was hard to deal with, but it was hard to fight against the passing of time. After all, men were fickle. They might be able to persist for 1 or 2 years but not 3 or 4 years. This thought made her eyes dim for a moment before they lit up again. The layout of the entire Wan City appeared in her mind and she suddenly thought of a wonderful place to go. Gong Che had indeed mobilized all his subordinates to seal off the entire Wan City. As for Gong Dai, he did not bring many people with him this time. Looking at the huge Wan City, he frowned slightly. He felt that Royal Sister was always giving him problems. Once the sun rose, there would be more people. They would not be able to catch Royal Sister. Even if Wan City was sealed, she would still have a way to blend in with the crowd. So only at night when there was no one around, she did not dare to act rashly. That was when it was easy to find. Before coming, Lo Chi had already reported the situation of Wan City to him. At this moment, Lo Chi pointed to a place and said, "Your Highness, previously you asked where the most crooked and honest people were in Wan City. It should be over there. That place is the city god temple. But it is summer now and many poor people and beggars live there. It is very chaotic." When Gong Dai heard this, he smiled faintly and immediately walked towards that place. Royal Sister said that the most likely place would become a safe place because it could easily mislead smart people. The city god temple was the best place to hide. So Gong Che thought that Royal Sister would not go to such an obvious place. But he thought that she would definitely be there. When Gong Yimo finished her disguise and accidentally barged into this dilapidated temple, her expression became complicated for a moment. Her aura fluctuated slightly, and even her black hair fluttered without any wind. This was the first time in her life that her emotions were so intense, because in her previous life, she had finally died here. At that time, she had been rescued from the death row prison and was preparing to leave Daiyu State for Yuheng that very night. However, Gong Dai had sealed off all the exits, leaving her with nowhere to run. Therefore, she gave up, stopped here, and told everyone to leave. But how could those brothers who had gone through fire and water leave her to die alone? It was only when she threatened them with death and told them the truth about her body that they left with hatred in their heart. Looking at the merciful Bodhisattva in front of her, Gong Yimo forgot to hide. There were so many people sleeping around her, but she acted as if she could not hear them. She stood there in a daze, as if she was the only one left in the world. She slowly turned around, and the surrounding environment actually began to change. It was as if she had returned to the winter of her previous life when she was running for her life. Once again, she saw with her own eyes the scene of those people kneeling in front of her and crying bitterly. She also seemed to see herself, covered in injuries, lying in a corner of this run-down temple, giving her final orders to the people in front of her who were unwilling to leave. "My body is like a lamp that has run out of oil. I can't live for much longer. Don't cry, before I die. I want you to promise me 3 things. Empress, don't be discouraged. We will definitely cure you. When the time comes, we will come back and kill that adulterous pair. His words made her laugh, and then she shook her head. That person's voice gradually lowered, and then turned into sobs. Men do not cry easily, but the woman in front of them was not only their master, but also their brother. Not only were they unable to treat her injuries, but they also wanted to betray her and leave. Adulterous pair. Gong Yimo coughed softly, and her eyes were smiling, as if showing some kind of psychedelic color, and said faintly, "Whether it is or not, I hope that you won't take revenge for me." "Why?" Someone's eyes were red. "They treated you like this. Why can't we take revenge?" That Gong Che is ungrateful, and Su Miaolan's heart is like a scorpion. And that Gong Dai, he is even more guilty. You worked hard to pacify the country, but what about them? They were still working together a second ago, and the next second, they put you to death. Such people can only atone for their sins with death. Gong Yimo smiled bitterly. They were her most loyal subordinates, as well as her most valiant warriors. They should be warriors whose names would be passed down through the ages, not rebels. Moreover, she had finally pacified the world. How could she be willing to start another dispute? Or for a few scum? So she smiled. Not all of them. In this world, everyone had two sides. One side was good to some people, and the other side was bad to others. Just like Kim Yoon and her master, they were very good to her. She suddenly missed her master a little. You still don't understand. Thinking of her master's tragic death, she closed her eyes. This is how the love between a man and a woman is. There is a beginning, there are ups and downs, and naturally, there is also an end. So, there is no right or wrong in this. At this point, she smiled again, but I am not a saint. In my heart, I also hate. I hate Jun for being fickle, hate Su Miaolan for being cruel. I hate that I was framed just after I handed over my power. But, in my heart, I don't hate. Her words were profound, and everyone looked at her with red eyes, not saying a word. Of course, the people in front of her were all tough and unyielding. Naturally, other than compassion, they could not understand her complex feelings. Gong Yimo smiled lightly, and looked away. 10 years of war. Jun changing his love is normal. Su Miaolan wanted to be the empress, but because of me, she waited for more than 10 years. It is normal for her to hate me to the bone. Gong Dai is ruthless and ambitious. It is even more normal for him to act against me. I am not saying this because I have forgiven these people, but I want you all to know that all of this is just a winner takes all. So, there is no resentment, only unwillingness. Unwillingness to lose. She paused, and it was unknown what she thought of, but her eyes blossomed with radiance. She was obviously in an extremely difficult situation, but her smile illuminated the entire ruined temple. But I am unreconciled. It is because, if not for the continuous years of war and killing, all of my desires have been obliterated, if not for the fact that I am used to seeing life and death, and if not for the fact that I am mentally and physically exhausted, even if I had handed over my power, I would not have been schemed against like this. So, I am unreconciled because they had an unfair advantage. They won dishonorably. When she said these words, she seemed to be a little depressed, but more than that, she was relieved. Now, I am about to die, but I am not afraid. Perhaps in my heart, I have been waiting for this day. Your Majesty. Of course, these are all words for later. A loss is a loss. If you are not willing to admit defeat and continue to send people to stir up trouble, that is not the conduct of a gentleman. So, you are not allowed to take revenge. Even if you want to take revenge, it should not be you. Chapter 201. All the soldiers present were silent. Their eyes were red as they gritted their teeth. They knew that perhaps this was Gong Yimo's idea. Because when she pacified the world, she did not have the ambition to continue to be the ruler. She only had a heart full of desolation and despair. Every time after a battle, she would stand on the battlefield and watch them dig pits to cremate the bodies. She also requested that not only the bodies of her own soldiers be cremated, but also the soldiers of other countries. The billowing smoke and the smell of burning flesh made these men hide far away. However, every time, she would stand there quietly and watch, allowing the heat wave to burn her face. Every time she won a great victory, she would be exhausted and sleep for 3 days and 3 nights. Her martial arts were unparalleled. How could she be so tired? She was just mentally tired. They watched helplessly as she turned from a mischievous young girl into a helpless killing god who did not know how to deal with violence. In the end, the Empress, who was clearly still elegant but had an old mentality, was filled with grief. They also understood that she was only saying this to prevent them from taking revenge. Now, Gong Dai and Gong Che each had half of the country. Her era had passed. They were no match for the Emperor and the Regent. They would only be sending themselves to their deaths if they forced themselves. This feeling of helplessness and defeat made people go crazy. Someone stood up and cried out in pain, "Are we just going to let them go like this? You may be a person with a knife, but don't they have any sins on them? Don't they need to suffer retribution?" When Gong Yimo heard this, she suddenly looked at them and slowly smiled. Like comforting a child, just like that quick-witted young girl in the past, she blinked and obviously deceived them. So it's like this. How about this? If there is a next life, I will definitely make it difficult for them. I will not admit defeat so easily. After she said this, she suddenly looked at a certain spot in the ruined temple. At this moment, she was sitting. And in this time and space, Gong Yimo was standing and looking in that direction. Time and space seemed to have overlapped in an instant. But one was a biting cold wind, the other was a cool summer night, one was middle-aged, the other was still young. They were the same person, but their gazes seemed to have collided. After a long time, she, who was covered in wounds, smiled faintly at her other self, causing the young Gong Yimo to suddenly tremble. Hugging his head, he squatted down. Can't let them have a good time. No, this wasn't what she wanted to do. At this time, a kind-hearted little old man saw that she was in pain and quickly got up. From the moment Gong Yimo came in, he had noticed her. She looked like a little boy from a poor family. She suddenly barged in and looked at Bodhisattva as if she had lost her soul. Now that she looked like she was in pain, it did not seem like she was faking it. "Young man, what happened to you? Are you sick?" He was a little worried because there was a rule in the temple that sick people were not allowed to stay. So if Gong Yimo was sick, she would either have to endure it or be kicked out. Gong Yimo was being pulled by someone. She grabbed him tightly and shot him a glare. It was as if he had grabbed onto a life-saving straw. "I'm fine. I'm just too tired." Hearing her words, the little old man, who was originally frightened by her glare, heaved a sigh of relief and quickly gave the spot he had prepared for her. "Since that's the case, this spot is for you. You can rest here. I'll sleep under the tree for the night." Gong Yimo opened her mouth and wanted to say that it was not necessary. However, the other party was very insistent. Because of the tremors in her body, she was too tired and finally lay down. As she lay down, her line of sight met the Bodhisattva in the middle of the temple. She was looking at her with a kind smile. In this life, almost 10 years had passed. No one would have thought that in this life, the moment she woke up in the cold palace, her first reaction was not happiness but pain. Why did she come back to life? Was she going to experience those terrifying nightmares again? Heaven was blind. She was an executioner who killed people like flies. How many innocent people had she caused to die tragically? Just like that kind-hearted old man just now, she had killed no less than 100 people. She was a vengeful spirit who was unwilling to accept her fate. No matter how open-minded she would still feel hatred and resentment. When she was violent, she would want to overthrow the dynasty again and bury everyone with her. But she was also a wanderer who was physically and mentally exhausted. In her previous life, she had experienced too much pain, doubts, frustrations, uneasiness, betrayal, and killings. Every time she saw villages being massacred, mountains and rivers blocked, as well as the schemes from the imperial court and the curses of the people, she felt physically and mentally exhausted. She thought that it was a mistake for heaven to let her transmigrate. She did not expect that she would be reborn again. However, her heart was full of holes and she did not want to live anymore. Later, she spent 3 whole days to figure out why she was reborn and what she wanted to do in this life. She wanted to atone for her sins. This thought suddenly gave her a new lease of life. She wanted to live on, so naturally, She did not want to take revenge. Humans were selfish. In her previous life, they had dealt with her for various reasons. In the end, she was tired and lost. She only had herself to blame. But in this life, she did not think that anyone could bring her any harm. So she did not need to kill those people to take revenge for something that had not happened yet. No, even if they wronged her, it did not matter. As long as they did not step on her bottom line, she would let them go. So when Gong Dai said that she was kind, she only smiled. If this was kindness, she felt that it was the indulgence of the strong towards the weak. She was proud. This pride came from her soul. She was a strong person. So she did not consider the consequences of her actions. Whether it was Gong Che, Gong Dai, Su Miaolan, Li Ku, or Sai Wuyen, she could let them all go. Because there were no consequences that she could not bear. If they wanted to kill, it was fine. But it should be based on a contest between people of the same level. But she was much stronger than them. She did not have the habit of bullying the weak. So she chose to forgive and not punish. Because she was a true superior. She was not afraid of anyone or any accidents. Of course, she also had a weakness. That was, she was afraid of love and ties. Love made people dull. Ties made people cower. And in this period of time, she seemed to be a little lost. But tonight, in the instant that she saw this bodhisattva, her thoughts seemed to clear up. Once again, she returned to those 3 days when she was reborn. She could not bear to see Gong Che. Because he was good to her in this life. She could not bear to see Gong Dai. Because she had no one to depend on. She needed Gong Dai to be her thoughts. He was equivalent to her spiritual support. She treated them as family. But originally, she did not have any family. Perhaps it was cruel to think this way. But those who could truly be carefree were those who could let go of everything. Whether they existed or not, it was all the same. They were emotional people. They were also heartless people. It was as if something had been pushed open. In an instant, the aura on her body underwent a tremendous change. She actually charged from the 4th level of wind and nature to the 6th level. She had reached the peak level of her previous life. Chapter 202. The strong qi energy immediately woke up everyone in the ruined temple. However, Gong Yimo's practice of this technique paid particular attention to her state of mind and rhythm. Therefore, not only did this qi not make them feel uncomfortable, but it also felt like a spring breeze. Some of the sore parts of their bodies were healed, and they all exclaimed in wonder, "It must be the Bodhisattva." Amidst the noise, someone shouted, and everyone in the temple got up and kowtowed to the Bodhisattva. Their movements alerted those who did not manage to get a bed in the temple, and they all ran in. When they saw them kowtowing, they asked for the reason, and could not help but kowtow as well, thanking the Bodhisattva for her grace. Gong Yimo did not move in the crowd. She sat cross-legged on the haystack, and her body had a vast and natural aura. Sometimes it was as gentle as the wind, sometimes it was as heavy as the earth. Gradually, some black dirt seeped out of her body, making her look even dirtier, but no one noticed her, or even looked at her. Because of this, she was like a strong wind, a tree full of vitality. From now on, as long as she wanted, she could make her aura disappear, and become an existence that could be seen, but not captured. At this moment, orderly footsteps were heard from afar, and Gong Yimo opened her eyes. The moment she opened her eyes, it was as if there was a flash of light. If someone met her eyes at this moment, perhaps their soul would be captured by her, and they would become muddle-headed and stupid. Then, the aura in her eyes gradually converged, and finally, her eyeballs gradually turned turbid, and her aura changed, turning into a lonely and pitiful poor boy. Deep in her eyes, there was despair towards this world. Then he slowly got up, and disappeared into the crowd, kowtowing to the Bodhisattva. The expression on his face was exactly the same as everyone else's, both grateful for the Bodhisattva's appearance, and hoping that she could reward them more. It would be best if she could let them escape poverty and make a comeback in one night. When Gong Dai saw this scene, the scene in front of him made him slightly confused. In the small temple, there were about 100 to 200 people, and they were kowtowing in the middle of the night, leaving him with no place to stand. When Lo Chi saw this, he quickly went in first, and grabbed someone to ask, "What are you doing?" Lo Chi's cold expression was very frightening. When the man saw it, he quickly stuttered. "It's Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva has appeared." Luo Chi was baffled, so he let go of him and asked a few more people in succession. However, the answers they received were mostly the same. Some said that the Bodhisattva had sent down a ray of holy light to cure all their illnesses. Others said that the Bodhisattva had blown a gust of celestial wind to make them feel refreshed and energetic. Luo Chi suspiciously returned to report to Gongju. Gongju was very dissatisfied with the ambiguous answer, so he walked in. Sensing Gong Dai walking in, Gong Yimo could feel that although his eyes were closed, she could feel that every step he took seemed steady. There was a slight sense of urgency and anxiety. After Gong Dai came in, he finally caused some chaos. Not to mention the murderous guards holding torches behind him, just his temperament alone was like an unsheathed sword. At this moment, his edge was revealed. Wherever the tip of the sword pointed, there were cowering and fearful eyes. "It's not her, it's not her. These people are not her." Gong Dai's sharp gaze swept across, but he became more and more uneasy. No matter how a person disguised, the things in their bones could not be changed. Just like how Royal Sister could disguise herself as a strategist, a noble son, or even an entertainer, but there was no fear in her bones. She could not pretend to be. And the reason why he was so uneasy was because he often felt that he was connected to Royal Sister by blood. When they were together, he could know what she was thinking with a glance or a movement. He could know whether she was happy or not. But just now, this connection was broken. He could not feel it at all. This realization made him almost crazy, and he could no longer maintain his calm. At this moment, he took out a bunch of banknotes from his chest and threw them out. Many people subconsciously went to pick them up, but when they saw the denomination, they were stunned. They exclaimed and scrambled to grab them. The scene became noisy. At this moment, Lo Chi suddenly pulled out his sword. With a whoosh, a cold light flash. And the other guards behind Gong Dai also pulled out their sword. He coldly looked at the group of people kneeling on the ground. This biting cold murderous aura made them stop scrambling for the banknotes. They all knelt there anxiously. In their hearts, they understood that the man in front of them was not the child of wealth sent by the Bodhisattva, but the god of death. "Speak. Did you see a young woman just now?" "Young woman? How could there be a woman in this run-down temple?" No one spoke. Gong Dai pulled at his collar and was a little annoyed. At this moment, his eyes fell on a thin man. Lo Chi quickly went forward and pulled him up, scaring him until he screamed. "Shut up. If you scream again, I'll cut off your tongue." Luo Chi threatened him in a low voice, and he quickly shut his mouth. His eyes darted around as he looked at them in fear. Gong Dai pointed at him and said to the crowd again, "Is there anyone who is the same height as him, male or female, who barged in the middle of the night?" At this moment, the kind-hearted little old man secretly raised his head to take a look. With one look, he was shocked. Just now, he was sleeping under the tree and came in when he heard the commotion. Then, so many things happened. It seemed that these people were here to look for someone, and this thin and small man was actually as tall as that strange young man. Could it be that they were here to look for that young man? His surprised expression did not escape Gong Dai's eyes. Lo Chi threw the man down and lifted the old man up again. "Speak. Did you see anyone suspicious?" Lo Chi asked coldly. The little old man was a little hesitant and scared. He was afraid that these people were here to seek revenge. If he spoke, wouldn't he be harming others? But he saw so many banknotes, the denomination, he had never seen before in his life. Perhaps if he said that the nobles casually gave him a banknote as a reward, it would be enough for him to live without worry. Thinking of this, he was a little ashamed, but he nodded firmly. Yes. Gong Dai's eyes lit up and he hurried forward. His aura was so strong that it made the little old man breathless. But Gong Dai did not care. He looked at him with a burning gaze and tried to use a calm tone to ask, "Is that person still here?" Thinking that the young man was very uncomfortable and had slept in the temple, he must still be here, so he nodded again. He should still be here. Where? Gong Dai grabbed him and turned him around, making him look at the crowd on the ground. "Raise your heads." At his command, everyone shrank back in fear and quickly raised their heads. Gong Dai looked at them with a complicated expression, then asked the old man expectantly, "Look carefully, that person, who is it?" Chapter 203. When the little old man heard this, he trembled as he looked at the people kneeling on the ground. These people were also a little afraid. Although they were forced to raise their heads, they did not dare to look into his eyes. This was because Gong Dai's aggressive manner did not look like he was looking for family, but more like he was seeking revenge. Although they were not the people Gong Dai was looking for, the fear of power made their eyes avert, making them feel very uneasy. Afraid that he could not see clearly, more than a dozen people holding torches came closer. Under the flickering flames, the little old man tried his best to identify the person. Previously, as there was no fire, he could only see the person coming through the moonlight. It was a youth in ragged clothes, but his eyes were clear. He was very different from the others. He believed that he would definitely find him, but when he looked at them one by one, he felt that they were not him. How could these cowering people be the youth from before? So he did not speak. Under Gong Dai's pressure, large beads of sweat rolled down his face and fell into his eyes. He could not help but rub his eyes before opening them again to look. Time passed bit by bit. No one in the dilapidated temple dared to make a sound. This youth was obviously an influential person. If they angered him, it was not impossible for him to kill them all. Therefore, the trembling old man was like a little demon under the king of hell. Whoever he pointed out would be on the king of hell's list. But after waiting for a long time, even Lo Chi was getting impatient. Did he recognize who it was? At this moment, the old man suddenly knelt down with a thud. He sprawled on the ground and said with a trembling voice filled with despair, "Lord, he's not here. There's no such person here." His words were like pouring a drop of ice water into a calm lava lake. Even those commoners who did not know martial arts could feel that at this moment, Gong Dai's killing intent had exploded and spread. "No." Gong Dai's voice was very calm. He lowered his head and looked at the old man who did not even dare to cry. He asked in a puzzled tone, "But just now, you clearly said that there was." The old man opened his mouth, but no words came out. Gong Dai closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he reached out and grabbed the old man. The old man's head was stuck in Gong Dai's hand, and all he needed to do was squeeze. That was enough to make him explode. The old man was so scared that his face was drained of all color. His whole body was shaking like a sieve. The feeling of impending death made him wish he was already dead. It was better than waiting for death in fear like this. He shouldn't have been greedy. If he hadn't said that he wanted to identify the culprit, he wouldn't be on the verge of death now. On the other hand, Gong Dai's aura surged, and his black hair fluttered without any wind. Clearly, he wanted to kill the person in his hand. But under his rage, he still had a trace of reason left. The royal sister doesn't like killing people. If she was here, watching him kill someone in a fit of rage, she would be unhappy. She would be unhappy. Gong Dai only felt a metallic taste in his throat. He covered his chest with one hand and swallowed it. After Ran Chi, he threw away the old man in his hand and looked at the people on the ground again. At this moment, his eyes were scarlet red, but deep in his eyes, there was sorrow. Wherever his gaze landed, there was no one who didn't shudder. These cowering eyes were not the eyes he was looking for. This thought made him want to kill all these people. Perhaps he could kill them one by one. The royal sister would come out on her own. Why doesn't she want to see me? It had been more than a year. Did she know how much he missed her? She didn't know. Gong Dai's murderous aura gradually disappeared, and in its place was a pain that was hard to ignore. Even though he was expressionless, the longing and disappointment in his eyes made these people gradually understand that this young man wasn't seeking revenge. Instead, he was looking for someone very important to him. Who was this person? No one said a word. Gong Yimo looked at Gong Dai with a face full of fear. That fear was faked, but also not faked. It was as if her appearance had completely changed, and only her heart still had a trace of clarity. Gong Dai, This person was a trace of concern that she had planted with her own hands. Because she had no blood relatives in this world, Gong Dai gradually became her spiritual sustenance. But she had no heart for love. Moreover, once Gong Dai was involved, it would inevitably involve Gong Che. She didn't want to be sandwiched between the two of them. Her whole person was surrounded by love and hatred, and it would complicate a simple matter. So, I'm sorry, she silently said in her heart. After a while, Gong Dai looked up and smiled. His smile was extremely sorrowful, causing everyone present to forget their fear and look up at him. Then, Gong Dai looked at the crowd and turned to leave. The corner of his black robe fluttered, and the flood dragon totem outlined with gold and silver threads seemed to come alive in the firelight. Gong Yimo tilted her head and looked at it, only feeling that fate was very interesting. And Gong Dai, he didn't give up. Since the royal sister wasn't here, then he would go somewhere else to look for her. He would definitely find her. Even if she didn't accept him, it didn't matter. There was still a lot of time. He could do it. After Gong Dai left, the rest of the people quickly followed. The people in the dilapidated temple were silent for a moment. Seeing that those people had really left, they hurriedly scrambled to snatch the banknotes. Gong Yimo blended in among them, remaining calm and collected. The commotion became louder and louder. Because of the unequal distribution of the loot, the people were fighting together. It was very funny. She really wasn't here? In the dark, Gong Dai stared at the group of people. Unexpectedly, no one was acting strangely. No matter how much a person disguised, it was impossible to disguise to this extent. Therefore, Gong Dai gritted his teeth and decisively gave up on this place. This time, he really left. Feeling that Gong Dai's breath had disappeared, Gong Yimo then retreated. Now, her realm was much higher than Gong Dai's. The difference between the 5th and 6th level could be said to be a watershed. Therefore, she firmly held the initiative and walked in with ease. Looking at the red-eyed people in the dilapidated temple and the kind-looking bodhisattva in the middle, she smiled slightly and pulled herself out, jumping out of the window. As for Gong Dai, he only realized after walking for a while that something was wrong. Oh no! He actually forgot such an important thing. Lo Chi was just about to ask when he saw Gong Dai rushing towards the dilapidated temple like the wind. As he ran, he scolded himself for being so stupid in his heart. Just now, those people said that they felt a celestial wind blowing past them and that they felt relaxed. That could very well be the phenomenon caused by Royal Sister's advancement in realm. When he broke through to the 5th level, because the murderous intent in his heart was too strong, he released his inner energy and destroyed the house like a sharp blade. However, Royal Sister was different. Her cultivation focused on the state of mind. Once she was calm, success would follow naturally. Therefore, the phenomenon caused by her advancement would definitely be different. It must be as those people described just now. Therefore, they mistakenly thought that it was the Bodhisattva's manifestation. She had just broken through and her realm was not stable yet. Therefore, she would definitely not move. Those people mistakenly thought that he appeared when the Bodhisattva manifested. Time was tight. Therefore, Royal Sister must have been in the dilapidated temple just now. Chapter 204. No matter how fast he was, it was too late. There were only red-eyed people in the temple. Gong Yimo couldn't still be there. Gong Ju's sudden intrusion caused the people in the temple to quiet down again. Their hair buns and clothes were in a mess. Some people tightly clenched the money in their hands, while others were full of anger because they didn't manage to snatch it. But all their emotions turned into fear when they saw Gong Dai. Even if the money they snatched just now was his, Gong Dai didn't say a word. He just stared at them coldly. They didn't dare to move and let Gong Dai's prying eyes slide past them one by one. Gong Dai's memory was amazing. He actually matched their faces with the faces in his memory. He used the most primitive method to check if anyone was missing. Although there was no light in the temple, the moonlight was very bright. He actually realized that there was a face missing. His brain automatically zoomed in on that person's face. It was a face covered in dirt. The pair of eyes were turbid and anxious. It was obviously a beggar. But the facial features were very similar to royal sisters. Why didn't he notice it just now? What was more frightening was that if he didn't compare them one by one, he wouldn't have remembered this person at all. It was as if he didn't even appear in his memory. This was a situation that had never happened before. Royal sister, how did she do it? Gong Dai became more and more uneasy. After confirming who it was, he turned and rushed out again. At this time, Lo Chi and the others also caught up. Your Highness, do you have any orders? Quickly go and tell the Crown Prince that royal sister has disguised herself as a man. She's about 20 years old. Also, a normal inspection won't be able to tell. She must be searched. Yes. Lo Chi accepted the order and quickly left. Gong Dai frowned slightly. There was no other way. He could only join forces with Gong Che. Now, he could only hope that with royal sister's lazy personality, she wouldn't change her disguise in a short period of time before he recognized her. But he was about to be disappointed again. When Gong Yimo came out of the dilapidated temple, he walked leisurely while wiping the traces on his face. Her goal was clear at this time. Since the land route couldn't work, she could only take the water route. It just so happened that she was dirty and needed to wash up. At the same time, Gong Dai also thought of this. Not far from the Xiing Wang temple was the moat of Wancheng. If there were guards everywhere on the land route, the royal sister would most likely take the water route. This was because the waterway map of the entire Daiyu state was in her mind. She definitely wouldn't let it go. The moon was bright and the stars were sparse. Gong Yimo threw away all the dirty clothes and didn't put them into the space. Then, she went into the water step by step. Although it was summer, the water at night was still a little cold, causing her white jade-like toes to tremble. Then, she steeled her heart and stepped in. He gritted his teeth and jumped into the water. Wancheng River was a tributary of the Yellow River. The water quality was still quite clear. If one walked along this river, they could get out of the city at both ends. But she wasn't in a hurry. She opened her mind and immersed herself in the water. After familiarizing herself with the water temperature, she felt like she had turned into a fish. It was as if she could breathe in the water. She was too anxious just now. She only had time to restrain her essence and didn't have time to stabilize her realm. Now that she was in the water and immersed in nature, she could achieve twice the result with half the effort. But not long after, before she could enter a meditative state, she heard footsteps from afar. Gong Yimo opened her eyes and plunged into the water. She held her breath and focused on the water surface. Gong Dai rushed here and found the clothes that Gong Yimo had thrown away. Royal sister. She really took the water route. Gong Dai didn't hesitate to continue chasing. Wancheng River had two directions. One led to the next town, and the other led to the wilderness. And the town was already guarded by the Crown Prince. Royal sister couldn't go to the town. So Gong Dai ran in the other direction, leaving Gong Yimo speechless. Sometimes, it was a kind of pain for someone to know you too well. But now, the Crown Prince had sent troops to find her. If she appeared again, it would only aggravate the situation. So even if she was unwilling, she still followed behind Gong Dai and swam in the direction of the wilderness. At this moment, one of them was on land, while the other was underwater. Luckily, she had already reached the 6th level of heaven and man as one. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to hold her breath for so long. Now, she only hoped that Gong Dai didn't find any traces of her after searching for a while. So, he thought that he had made a mistake and chased in the opposite direction. Only then would she be able to breathe a sigh of relief. Gong Dai was very anxious at this moment. Royal sister had grown too quickly. And now, she had completely cut off the connection between them. This made him even more uneasy. He could only find her as soon as possible. He had to find out the reason behind all this. Otherwise, how could he calm down? What was the world under the water like? Gong Yimo swam along with the flow of the water. She was like a fish, moving according to the rhythm of the water. She was obviously running away, but because of this wonderful experience, she became tranquil. It made it harder for people to notice that she was actually in the water. Sometimes, she would even look at the running Gong Dai through the shadows of the water and sigh faintly. Why was he so persistent? In this world, there was no lack of people. Many things that were gone would never be found again. But people were different. When one person left, there would be countless people to replace him. At this moment, Gong Dai's figure suddenly staggered. He covered his chest and knelt down on one knee. Earlier in the dilapidated temple, he had forced himself not to kill people, which had caused his blood to boil. Later, when he found out that he had missed out on the royal sister, he couldn't calm down. And now, he was running at lightning speed, full of anger. Finally, because of his unstable blood and chi, he knelt on the ground. He couldn't help but angrily hammer the ground, his chest heaving up and down violently. Damn it! Why was it like this? Why was he so weak? Why? His hand covered his chest again, and he closed his eyes. He really couldn't feel any connection with her. This realization made his chest ache. What had happened to the royal sister? Gong Yimo also felt a little uncomfortable at this moment, as if her chest was stuffy. She knew that because she and Gong Dai practiced the same martial arts, and had always understood each other, their hearts and minds were interlinked. In some aspects, they could sense each other like conjoined twins. Therefore, she hurriedly calmed herself down, not wanting to be influenced by Gong Dai. Gong Ju, on the other hand, didn't notice the slight change. As long as he thought of Sister Gong's superb disguise technique, he felt scared. If he couldn't find a way to break it, he might not be able to find her in this lifetime. He couldn't have her. Then he would live like this. What was the point? And what was the point? Under the intense stimulation, his chest ached. He couldn't hold it in any longer, and spat out a mouthful of blood. Gong Yimo also suddenly felt a pain in her heart, and she panicked. It almost made her disheartened. Gong Dai, why did he spit out blood? Not being able to find her, was it something so difficult to accept? At this moment, his unstable emotions made Gong Dai raise his head to look at the water. He felt it. Chapter 205. Although it was only for a moment, he could feel that his royal sister was right beside him. She was not far from him. He wiped the blood from the corner of his lips and stood up abruptly. He looked around and his gaze fell on the water surface once again. Under the moonlight, the surface of the water sparkled and flowed slowly. Under the water, Gong Yimo did not dare to move at all. She even had a misconception that Gong Dai had discovered her because of her momentary lapse in concentration. Very quickly, her nightmare became reality because Gong Dai had actually jumped into the water. The water splashed everywhere and under the moonlight, it looked like broken starlight dancing around. However, Gong Yimo could not appreciate this. She quickly retreated, but it was too late. A pair of large hands. They fiercely grabbed her shoulders and she was forced to be lifted up. Caught you. His cold and unique voice rang in her ears. At this moment, Gong Dai's entire body was drenched. However, his pair of sparkling eyes sized up Gong Yimo and he could not get enough of her. He could not bear to blink no matter how hard he tried. All the depression in this moment was dispelled. All the resentment and pain of yearning were soothed at this moment. His royal sister was finally in his hand. Gong Yimo seemed to be burned by his intense gaze and subconsciously used her hand to cover his eyes. God knows, she was not wearing any clothes. However, before she could do anything, she was already tightly pulled into Gong Dai's embrace. That strong heartbeat, Gong Yimo could clearly hear it. Gradually, her heartbeat, which had slowed down because she had immersed herself in nature, gradually recovered and intertwined with his heartbeat. Thump, thump, it was as if there was some kind of resonance. This kind of intimacy made Gong Yimo's face quietly turn red. Even she did not know what was going on. She had clearly said that she would not be moved, so why did she feel at a loss? I feel it, Gong Dai suddenly sighed in her ear. I feel your presence again. He let go of Gong Yimo and pointed at her chest, then at his own heart. There's a connection between this place and this place again. At this moment, Gong Yimo didn't know why, but she felt a lump in her throat. She blinked but couldn't speak. Gong Dai looked at her in a daze. His royal sister had grown up again. Her eyebrows and eyes were more and more beautiful, especially under the moonlight. The water droplets on her hair fell on her bare shoulders and directly slid into the water. Her skin was like cream and her beauty was like jade. At this moment, her eyes were bright as she looked at him timidly. This was still his royal sister. She hadn't changed. If there was a change, it would be that she had become more attractive to him, making him want to touch her more and more. Gong Dai, why do you have to find me? Gong Yimo took a few steps back, hugged her chest, and asked with a sigh. It's been more than a year. Haven't you changed at all? She was referring to his heart. Why hadn't he changed? Could it be that a year was too short? I've changed, Gong Dai said in a low voice. When she took a step back, he approached her and forced her to the lakeside. Gong Yimo couldn't help but look up at him. Since you've changed, then why are you still? I've become more in love with you. He said the last 4 words by her ear. His tone was joyful, but more than that, there was bitterness. After so many days and nights, not only did it not fade away, but it also became clearer in his description of his longing. Her every frown and smile was just like before. I've changed. I've become crazy about you. I've become so in love with you. I can't even recognize myself anymore. He gently pressed his forehead against Gong Yimo's forehead. He closed his eyes and their breaths intertwined. At this moment, he felt very happy and satisfied. Just a moment ago, he was still in pain, but now, he was filled with sweetness. When I was 9 years old, I thought that you were just a momentary infatuation for me. Very soon, I would correct everything. Unfortunately, I didn't. When I was 11 years old, I thought that a long separation would fade away this infatuation. Unfortunately, I didn't. When I was 14 years old, you left me. I tried my best to become stronger, to mature. At that time, I thought that I could endure this longing, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. Do you know how painful it is to miss someone? Sometimes, even breathing is painful. I really wish that you were by my side, somewhere that I can touch. So when I miss you, I followed what you said before and went to decorate the imperial residence. Now, it's already very beautiful. Didn't you say that you wanted a home? That's our home. When he said this, he couldn't help but kiss Gong Yimo's lips. At this moment, the wind calmed down, the water calmed down, and his heart also calmed down. That soft touch was just as beautiful as the dream, making him indulge in it. As their lips and teeth intertwined, he kissed and whispered at the same time. I thought that I was already very strong, and they were all afraid of me. I also worked very hard, and always wanted to become even stronger. But I don't know why, when I met you, I panicked. I became worried about my gains and losses, I became cautious, I became compromising. His voice became softer and softer, and in the end, it seemed that he was really wronged. After he kissed her, he reluctantly stepped back and looked deeply into her eyes, full of helplessness. But you made me like this, but I don't hate you, I don't hate you. Instead, when I see you, I'm happy. When I hug you, I'm satisfied. I'm probably incurable. These lingering words of love made Gong Yimo very resistant. She was a little afraid and wanted to step back. But behind her was a rock, and she couldn't retreat. Don't say any more, I don't want to hear this. But what if you don't listen? Only you can listen to these words. As he said that, a dangerous light flashed in his eyes, and he got closer to her again. Although they couldn't see anything in the water, Gong Yimo felt as if his gaze was scraping her whole body, and she started to tremble slightly. He smiled faintly. If you really don't want to hear it, then I'll do it for you. As he said that, he kissed her again without giving her any chance to protest. He wrapped himself around her tightly, his hands hugging her body tightly, but his breathing was very rapid, and it was obvious that he wasn't as calm as he appeared to be. That passionate anticipation, as well as the sweetness and gentleness with care, made Gong Yimo's action of pushing him away become hesitant. And even though he was so eager, he wasn't too impulsive. He seemed to have gathered all his strength in his hands, and used that to suppress the desire in his heart, but also to greedily want more. And he had really grown up. Compared to when he was young, his words were more shameless. Perhaps this was a man's talent. Gong Yimo thought helplessly, but her heart was more conflicted. Really? She had never hesitated on important matters, so why did she become like this when it came to relationships? Was it just because he was Gong Dai? Chapter 206. Gong Yimou's quietness satisfied Gong Dai and made him a little uneasy. Every time she wanted to do something that made him unhappy, she would become very obedient. This made him gnash his teeth in hatred. Why didn't you resist? Gong Dai let go of her and asked in a low voice, You didn't push me away because you have me in your heart. Gong Yimou looked at him for a long time without saying a word. Her silence made Gong Dai's heart ache, but it was okay. He pulled himself together and asked again. Last time, you said that if I love you, I have to rely on my own strength. Now, I've caught you. He stared into her eyes. Will you still leave? He thought carefully, full of anticipation, just for her to respond a little. But when Gong Yimou saw his sincere eyes, she knew that he really had not let go of this relationship. She was silent for a moment and finally said slowly, I still have something to do. At this moment, the aura on his originally gentle body suddenly exploded. He grabbed her wrist tightly and did not let go. Can I ask why? Something to do. With such a reason, did she think that he was still a child? He tried hard to suppress his anger and resentment, afraid that he would hurt her. But he was more afraid that if she left, then, he would really not be able to control himself and hurt her. Gong Yimou sighed. Under the moonlight, she looked lost, but she was still determined. Let's put it this way. Actually, I don't want to get involved in love, and I don't have the energy to stop the gossip. I don't want to bring you trouble. There's no trouble. Gong Dai quickly said, No matter what you bring, it's a gift to me, not a trouble. He hugged her gently as if he was hugging the entire world. His murderous heart actually gave birth to a trace of gratitude. I don't need you to stop the gossip. As long as you agree, I'll do everything well. Whoever dares to talk nonsense, I'll make sure that they die a horrible death. You don't need to care about anything. As for getting involved in love, isn't that beautiful? I'll treat you like a treasure and dote on you forever. Why don't you want to? At this point, he suddenly felt a little pained. Or is it because you're unwilling to do it with me? Gong Yimou reached out and patted his back, sighing faintly. It's not directed at you. I won't marry anyone, and I won't love anyone. It's just that I've already made up my mind, and I treat everyone equally. Why? Gong Dai buried his head in her neck and questioned her in a deep voice. He was in so much pain, and his entire being was wailing because he couldn't get what he wanted. Why was the person he loved so bitterly unwilling to love him? She wasn't even willing to share a little bit of love with him. Instead, she was only willing to give him those laughable familial ties. Why? For some reason, Gong Yimou suddenly remembered the words she said before she died in her previous life. If there's a next life, I'll definitely make them suffer. She shook her head repeatedly to get rid of these thoughts, but then she remembered that before the war, when they were leaving, Gong Che had held her hand and said no matter when he returned, he would never let her down. Afterwards, the image of Su Miaolan's victorious face flashed through her mind, as well as Gong Dai's unconcealed killing intent towards her. She shuddered. She suddenly remembered the vow she made before the Buddha in her next life. She would never love anyone again. Yes, she would never love anyone again. If she didn't love, then she wouldn't hate, resent, or suffer. Sensing Gong Yimou's sudden determination, Gong Dai suppressed his bloodthirsty impulse and asked word by word. Even if it's just staying by my side and being loved by me, it's still not okay? He stepped back and suppressed all his pain. He forced a smile and whispered a request. You can choose not to love me. No. As long as you're by my side, being loved by me, that's enough. Can't I even do that? Gong Yimou looked at him. He was becoming more and more like the regent in her previous life. He had monopolized power and seized power, and he had smiled and taken over her little by little. Some things that could be forgotten had long been forgotten, such as hatred. However, she couldn't forget, no matter how hard she tried, such as trauma. The most beautiful thing in this world was love. It wasn't because it was the sweetest, but because it had the shortest duration and the greatest risk. The more dangerous it was, the more addictive it was. Hence, she shook her head. Under the moonlight, her expression was cold and determined. She didn't need to be influenced by anyone. In this life, she only wanted to live for herself. Gong Dai's eyes gradually deepened and turned red. The hostility in his body was increasing and spreading. However, he had been suppressing it at a critical point. He had been suppressing it and hadn't exploded. In the end, he only asked one question. What do I have to do to make you belong to me? Gong Yimo closed her eyes and asked herself. Since he hadn't been willing to give up for more than a year, then she would just force him to. Hence, she forced herself to put on a cold face and said lightly, I've always belonged to you, but as an older sister. If you don't want to, we can still be strangers. Strangers. That one sentence made Gong Dai's face turn pale. The suppressed hostility seemed to have disappeared in an instant. Only fear and uneasiness were left. His entire heart felt like it was being cut by 1,000 knives. It was a heart-wrenching pain. He couldn't even believe that this was what the royal sister said to him. Strangers. In the water, he retreated, but he almost couldn't control his body and sank into the water. After a while, he steadied his body and pointed at himself as he asked softly, Strangers. Gong Yimo looked at his deranged expression and couldn't bear it. However, she gritted her teeth and didn't say anything, because once she accepted Gong Dai, Gong Che wouldn't be satisfied. Moreover, they were brothers and sisters. With their positions, such a relationship would only be trouble for them. Perhaps in the beginning, they would be willing to solve these problems because of love. However, as more and more troubles came and threatened them, they would be fed up with it. When that time came, how would she deal with it? As for herself, she was the one who hated trouble the most. Hence, it was best to forget about this relationship. She didn't need it. She didn't have the time. Perhaps, she didn't dare to try. Hence, she hardened her heart and said, You and I are siblings. This is an undeniable fact. Perhaps you're not afraid of being maliciously attacked by others. You're not afraid of me, this troublesome body, bringing you endless trouble. You're not afraid of being entangled in love and hate, but I'm afraid. After saying that, she turned to leave, but Gong Dai held her tightly. He forcefully carried Gong Yimo to the shore. On the grass, he pressed her down tightly. As soon as they left the water and the wind blew, her body shivered slightly due to the cold. However, her eyes were clear and she ignored Gong Dai's pain. She was determined. Who wants to be your brother? He laughed louder and louder. I just want to be your man. I'm not afraid of what you said. I don't care. Even if you're afraid, I'll settle it for you. Now, be my woman. Chapter 207. As he spoke, he actually pulled off his clothes. Seeing that he was serious, Gong Yimo was stunned and did not speak for a long time. He was very fast and his clothes slid down. However, his whole body was pressing down on Gong Yimo, not allowing her to escape. I should have done this long ago. I shouldn't have let you go. I should have broken your wings and let you lie under me obediently. The more he spoke, the more excited he became. His eyes were shining and his black hair was hanging down. He was so beautiful. However, the pain and anger that could not be dispersed made him look extremely abnormal. Under the moonlight, there was a strange and twisted feeling. It was as if he was an unredeemable demon, using his beautiful skin to drag the world to hell with him. You won't. The brother that I raised is not someone who will force me. Gong Yimo did not believe it. She did not believe that Gong Dai would really do that. If he really loved her, he would not force her when she was unwilling. Therefore, she only opened her eyes and looked at him stubbornly. She watched him take off his clothes one by one and watched him kiss and bite her skin as if he was venting his anger. Instead of saying that the two of them were being intimate, it was more like they were venting. Not brother, not brother. He gritted his teeth in pain, but there was nothing he could do. It was a pity that he could handle it with ease in front of outsiders. No one dared to provoke him. However, she would only make him helpless. She was right. He would not force her, even if she forced him to the edge of the cliff. He couldn't do anything to hurt her in the slightest. Finally, Gong Dai stopped because she was very calm. She did not act rashly for him at all. This knowledge made him numb from the pain again. However, After the numbness, he still felt pain. However, he could not let go. Since that was the case, he could only stay calm. If one path did not work, there were other paths. He could not panic. As long as he could have her, he could endure the pain even if his bones were broken. Gong Yimo blinked and looked at him. However, she saw that his expression was indescribable. He looked calm, but he was extremely dangerous. Gong Ju also looked at her with a heavy expression. She once said that all problems have a reason, and finding the reason is the root of the solution. Therefore, he could not be ruthless, crazy, or unyielding. In the end, he greedily looked at her beautiful body. This body would be his sooner or later. Only by telling himself this over and over again would he not be driven crazy by her word. Only then could he calm down. Then, he picked up his coat and gently wrapped it around Gong Yimo. It was just like when she was young in the cold palace, wrapping herself in clothes with a faint scent of incense. It was just that she did it out of sympathy, but in his eyes, there was only deep love. Gong Yimo slowly let out a sigh of relief. Although she was now more powerful than Gong Dai, she did not want to make a move against Gong Dai, so she endured until he regained his senses. Fortunately, he did not disappoint him. While he was putting on his clothes, his hot breath landed on her face more than once. His fingers were stiff and extremely restrained. After helping her put on her clothes, Gong Dai put on his inner clothes and helped her up to sit by the side of Wan Shui. The summer night wind sent waves of coolness. Gong Yimo seemed to come back to life and took a deep breath. Gong Dai said in a hoarse voice, "Royal sister, you once said that there is nothing that cannot be said to others. Words can resolve all conflicts. Then, please tell me, why do you reject me like this?" He lowered his head. Gong Yimo could only see that the side of his face was tense. It was obvious that even though he had calmed down now, he was still on the verge of exploding. He was just trying his best to control himself and not hurt her. Therefore, she could not provoke him anymore. "It's not that I reject you." Gong Yimo wanted to sigh again. She thought about how she had educated him back then, but she had also explained the reason. It was just that he had not listened. "Gong Dai, have you ever thought about what kind of path you will take in the future? You have your own path." He said this sentence without thinking. Gong Yimo felt that this reason could not be explained any further. "Then have you ever thought about what kind of path I will take?" Gong Dai looked at her and thought, "Naturally I have my own path." Gong Yimo thought about the so-called war and raised her hand to point at the stars in the sky. "I will change this world for the better. The world is very big. I don't know how far I will go and how many people will stand in my way." Gong Dai's black jade-like eyes were stunned for a moment. He really did not understand why she would do this. She could be kind because she had the ability to forgive people. Therefore, this kind of kindness was also a kind of strength. But why would she want to do these things? This was not a thought that a woman should have. "Therefore, I may bring more trouble in the future. Whether it is the infamy of violating human relations or the spying of weapons, in the future, I may encounter more complicated problems than these. For example, the people in the world do not understand, or the obstacles of those in power and so on." Gong Yimo saw that Gong Dai wanted to say something. She suddenly smiled and said, "Listen to me first. You are the only thing I care about in my life, the only thing I can rely on. That's why I don't want to bring these things to you. Without me, you could have lived a carefree life. But with me, every step you take will be difficult and painful. You might even die. A person's strength is limited. I believe that you love me and I also believe that you can hold on for a long time. But I don't believe that you will hold on until the end." Yes, this was the reason why she didn't want to start. No man would be willing to get himself into trouble for a woman. In order to maintain their relationship, they could only inject happiness and not pain. They could only inject passion and not shock. Therefore, she would rather not start. Since she would not give up on her own thoughts, she would not bind another person's life, even if he was willing. "You are not me, so how can you say that I can't hold on? You are not me, so how can you say that every step I take will be difficult and I may even die?" Gong Dai asked softly. But it was obvious that he was not convinced. Gong Yimo smiled and said, Because you are not 15 yet, people change. Your life is so long and there are so many variables. Your mind is even more fickle. I don't want to take the risk. Gong Yimo's words were like a bucket of cold water poured on him. Although he was disappointed, he could not refute it. Gong Dai sneered, I don't agree with your conclusion without trying. In the end, it's just because you don't believe me. His eyelashes trembled as he lowered his eyes, hiding his unwillingness. She did not believe him. Gong Yimo was slightly stunned. But what she did not believe was not him, but her feelings. Seeing that Gong Yimo did not say anything, Gong Dai's eyes gradually filled with hostility. There was an uncontrollable madness. If that's the case, royal sister, why don't you give it a try? Gong Yimo looked at him. She saw an invisible aura surging around him. He stood up, his black hair flying. He looked down at her and smiled wickedly. Stay by my side and give it a try. Otherwise, if you want me to let you go, I can't do it. Gong Yimo heard this and stood up as well. Compared to Gong Dai, her aura was gradually sharper. Her aura was long and calm, with a natural rhythm. I won't stay. You have your things to do. I have mine too. Chapter 208. At the edge of Wanshirei, Gong Ju stood opposite Gong Yimo for the first time. His whole body was covered with internal energy, and it was piercingly cold like a sharp blade. However, his expression was one of pain. He practiced martial arts every day, but not to deal with her. Gong Yimo smiled. Come, you have things that you can't give up. I understand. I also have things that I can't give up. Now, let me see how much you've grown. Gong Dai could not possibly leave with Gong Yimo. Even if he wanted to, Gong Yimo had told him when he was young that if the gap between a man and woman was too big, there would not be a good ending. So if he gave up his authority, he would not have the qualifications to have her. If he did not give up, he would not be able to follow her as he pleased. That was a helpless situation. The same was true for Gong Yimo. She returned to his side. She still hadn't solved the problem of carrying a weapon. Her only option was to hide her identity forever and blend in with him, but that wasn't the life she wanted. Since both sides could not change their standpoints, it looked like they could only fight. Gong Dai was silent. He felt that although Gong Yimo's body was gentle, it was a strong aura. His eyes became clearer and clearer. He knew that the other party's realm had surpassed his. Although it was just a breakthrough, there was a qualitative change. But he would not admit defeat. He could protect her. So, he must keep her. The two of them finally exchanged blows. With this exchange, Gong Ju immediately felt the suppression of his opponent's realm. Although it seemed weak, it was in fact continuous. Gong Yimo was slightly speechless. Gong Dai was clearly lower than her by a realm, but every move and style of his made her expend some effort. Of course, it was because she had just advanced and her realm was not stable. But more importantly, it was because of Gong Dai's own diligence and talent. Gong Ju. Does he still only sleep for 2.5 hours a day? She was afraid that the time he spent practicing martial arts every day was more than the time he rested. Under the moonlight, their clothes fluttered due to their inner strength. Although they didn't use any weapons, both of them were able to transform their inner strength. Therefore, even without the use of weapons, the surrounding trees and water seemed to be pulled and tossed about by gravity. When sand and dust filled the air, even the starry sky seemed to be covered. Gong Yimo gradually became anxious, because if they stayed here for too long and were discovered by Gong Che, it would be even more troublesome. However, no one knew how Gong Dai cultivated, but his moves were swift and fierce, and his aura was oppressive. He actually fought her to a draw. Gong Dai could clearly feel that royal sister had surpassed him. The only reason he was able to keep up with her was because he only attacked and did not defend. In the end, the two of them separated with a palm strike. Gong Dai retreated a few steps, while Gong Yimo landed lightly on top of a tree. This kind of Qing Gong was unparalleled in the world. You really can't stay for me. Gong Dai was wearing a moon-white inner garment, and his expression was sorrowful. There seemed to be invisible blades dancing around his body. They were crazily tearing apart everything around him. His eyes were filled with deep sorrow and helplessness. He was like a trapped beast. Other than destroying everything else, he was destroying himself. Gong Yimo thought for a while, then suddenly looked at him and asked softly, "Are you willing to give up everything in your hands, conceal your identity, and follow me without any power or influence?" Her words were too much, but she wanted Gong Dai to see reality clearly. "Don't be stubborn." Gong Dai was stunned. If he gave up everything to follow her, then what right did he have to stand beside her and own her openly? How could he have the strong confidence to chase away all the people who peeped at her? Under the situation where he couldn't even protect himself, what right did he have to protect her? He couldn't accept this kind of difference. They weren't husband and wife, but subordinates. So he hesitated. This wasn't what he wanted. Gong Yimo smiled faintly. "Then you want me to conceal my identity, hide my appearance, be careful by your side, be protected by you, and then hide from other people's prying eyes?" Her eyes were also filled with misery. In this life, she was born without any worries, but she didn't come here to be entangled in love. If she gave up love, she could still have a lot. But if she gave up her freedom, even her heart would be pulled into chaos. She would have nothing. "You're not willing, and I'm not willing. So this is a knot that can't be untied." But, she changed the topic and said, "Even so, it's not like there's no way." Gong Dai's aura calmed down because of her words. He sincerely asked for her advice. "Tell me, what else can I do?" Gong Yimo smiled condescendingly. This smile was absolutely beautiful. Her black coat fluttered, revealing her snow-white legs and glowing skin. She was like a seductive seductress, doing her best to entice him into indulgence. He heard her dreamy voice, "You have to become the strongest person in the 4 countries. Everywhere you go, people will kneel and greet you. At least, you have to be above father." When she said this, she was thinking about his glory in his previous life. That was the path that belonged to him, to become a strong person, and not a romantic who was trapped by love. So Gong Yimo covered her mouth and smiled, continuing to provoke him, "If you can't compare to father, how can I return to Dai Yu State and cause trouble for you? Jin this may be difficult, but you can wait for me to solve all the problems and return. It's just that, this is also difficult, but I'm not afraid." Gong Dai suddenly smiled, "I'm not afraid either." His gaze met with Gong Yimo's. When their eyes met, both of them seemed to feel their hearts tremble. Towards her, he couldn't bear to part with her, but if he became the strongest person in Dai Yu State, she would be able to return to his side with peace of mind. No matter how difficult the future was, he wasn't afraid. Gong Yimo's heart relaxed slightly. His hard work made her heart feel like it had been lightly knocked by something. After all, he was someone that she had nurtured with all her heart. He had never disappointed her. "Now, in Yuheng, I'm preparing to take over all the pawn shops to establish a golden chain, just like the pyramid I told you about before. Once this plan takes shape, the benefits it will bring in the future are unimaginable. However, the reason Yuheng is so successful is because the Yuheng Emperor is captivated by the second prince's mother. As a result, the Emperor's words are practically the law in the imperial court. If you want to do this in Dai Yu State, I'm sure you'll encounter a lot more obstacles. Even so, I still hope that you will do this. This is to prevent the Yuheng Emperor from becoming too ambitious in the future and extending his hand into Dai Yu State. Therefore, you have to be the first person to establish a golden chain in Dai Yu State." Gong Dai looked at her quietly. "I can do it." Gong Yimo pursed her lips and smiled. "Lu Yi is getting restless. I'm afraid that war will break out in the next few years. You have to be careful too." "I know. Do you still remember that I told you to plant spies in the 4 countries and be the first person in the chain of information? I will remember every single word of Royal Sister's words in my heart. Then, I'm relieved." As she spoke, she looked into the distance. Her eyes were filled with longing. She didn't know how far she would go, but no matter which step she took, it wouldn't be peaceful. That was why it was interesting. She looked at Gong Dai again and smiled provocatively. "Come, if you still want to stop me, let's fight again. Let me give you some pointers, just like in the past." Gong Dai suddenly smiled bitterly. "No, this time, I'll watch you leave." Chapter 209. Gong Yimo was taken aback by his words, but he suppressed the bitterness in his heart, tried his best to calm down, and said calmly, "You don't believe me. Time will prove that my feelings for you. No matter how much pain I go through, it will only be deeper and not shallow." The love in his eyes was so real that Gong Yimo felt like she was about to fall into his eyes and be unable to extricate herself. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. "And right now, I don't want to let you go either, but I can't lock you down." He closed his eyes. She was the only person in his life that he felt so powerless. His face turned pale, and he smiled bitterly. "Since I can't lock you down, I can only try my best until I can lock you down before I make my move. So this time, I want to be free for once and watch you leave." Gong Yimo was shocked. She looked deeply into Gong Dai's eyes. He was obviously in pain, but he was willing to let go. Not only did this not make her feel relieved, it made her feel even heavier because of his deep feelings. She didn't know how to repay him. "Aren't you leaving?" Gong Dai suddenly looked up and smiled. His cold eyes were even colder under the moonlight. He was like a demon who had come back to life, and he already had the beauty of a peerless generation. He looked at her, blinked, and took a deep breath. "If you don't leave, I'm going to regret it." Gong Yimo came back to her senses. She looked at him with a complicated expression, and with a light tap of her feet, she walked along the river. Looking at her leaving figure, Gong Dai wanted to laugh and mock himself, but he felt powerless. He sat down cross-legged and slowly closed his eyes. He couldn't stop her now, and there was no point in trying to. He might as well take the opportunity to shake her. Even if her heart only wavered for a moment, it was enough. The number one person in Daiyu State? This road was really long, but he just wanted to keep going, to keep going. Royal Sister didn't believe that he could persevere, so he did it for her. The Royal Sister was afraid of love, so he forced her to accept him. In this world, there was no one who couldn't be defeated, and no one who couldn't be moved. If he couldn't be moved, then it must be because he hadn't done enough. Gong Yimo successfully left the city by water. After leaving the heavily guarded WN city, she turned back and silently apologized to Gong Che in her heart. One Gong Dai was enough to give her a headache. If Gong Che was added to the mix, she would definitely go crazy. Therefore, in the future, if they could avoid meeting, it would be better not to. The word love was really annoying. She felt that a few strands of her hair had turned white from worry. In the next few days, Gong Yimo finished everything she needed to do and prepared to go to Yuheng. At this time, she disguised herself as a man and walked on the streets of the border town. She had a lot of customs documents in her space. She had them from every country. In this era, it was too easy for Gong Yimo to sneak into other countries with electronic devices. The sun was just right, but she didn't know why she felt gloomy, as if there was something that she hadn't finished. So she wandered around the streets and conveniently brought a gift for Kim Yoon. At this moment, a beautiful woman bumped into her. Gong Yimo felt that she was reaching out to touch her purse, so she immediately grabbed her. "This young lady, it's not good to steal things." Gong Yimo smiled and whispered in her ear. When the woman saw that she was caught, she was shocked and flustered. She struggled a few times but couldn't break free, so she hurriedly shouted, "Someone come! I'm being molested, save me." Gong Yimo was speechless. But she still remembered that she was in the image of a man, so she still let go of her. "This young lady, you were obviously the one who was caught stealing. Isn't it too unreasonable to play the blame game?" But that woman was a habitual thief, so how could she be reasonable? As she cried, she hurriedly grabbed someone and said, "Young master, save me. That person wants to molest this servant in broad daylight. I beg young master to uphold justice." Gong Yimo looked at the person she was grabbing and laughed. The other party was obviously a girl dressed as a man. Her chest was not tied up, so it was too obvious. But when that young lady heard it, she really believed it. With a cold face, she pulled out the whip on her waist and said, "Preposterous. Don't be afraid, I'm here. Let's see who dares to bully you." The thief saw that someone really believed her, so she hurriedly nodded and hid behind her, waiting for an opportunity to escape. Gong Yimo looked at that young lady with interest and laughed. "Don't be fooled by her. I don't have any feelings for her." Seeing her laugh carelessly, that young lady became even angrier. "Pei, you don't look like a good person. You obviously saw that she was pretty and framed her as a thief. I've seen many lechers like you. I, Long Hanyang, must get rid of this evil for the people today." When she said her name, Gong Yimo had a vague impression of her. But she was puzzled because this Long Hanyang should have died long ago. She died of illness, so why was she still alive? It seems that her rebirth had changed many people's lives. But why did she run out instead of staying in the imperial palace? She did not speak, which made Long Hanyang even angrier. She lashed out with her whip. When Gong Yimo regained her senses, she lightly stretched out her hand and caught it. She somewhat helplessly said, "This young lady, aren't you being too indiscriminate? Being so fierce, you won't be able to get married." When the onlookers heard this, they all laughed. Long Hanyang could only blame herself for not dressing like a man. What kind of good girl would dress up as a man in broad daylight? But Long Hanyang suddenly thought of Gong Dai's cold eyes. He still wanted to kill her, so Gong Yimo's words could be said to have stepped on her sore spot. Her eyes flashed with murderous intent. She suddenly pulled out her whip and her moves suddenly became fierce. "Disgraceful. You're the one who won't be able to get married. Go to hell." Seeing that Long Hanyang was serious, the onlookers swarmed and dispersed. "Murder. A woman is killing on the streets," someone shouted. And Qiu Xingfeng, who was buying dry rations from afar, heard it. He secretly cursed. It must be his little disciple who was causing trouble again. Why did she use the word again? Because on their way here, his little disciple seemed to have eaten something. She wanted to poke her nose into things she did not like, so they walked for so many days before arriving at Border City. His thoughts were simple, so naturally he would not guess that Long Hanyang was angry because she did not get what she wanted, so she pulled people to vent her anger. He only thought that his disciple liked to fight for justice, so he hurriedly ran towards the direction of the sound. Gong Yimo did not dodge at all. She stood at the same spot and let her whip. But even so, that whip seemed to have grown eyes and did not land on her body. This was the advantage of the 6th level, to dissipate the force. Long Hanyang knew that she had met an expert and did not know how to end the situation. In the end, she saw Qiu Xingfeng's figure and hurriedly said, "Master, save me. This person wants to kill me." You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.